Alright guys, Bulem here, back with a new video, and in this video, we're back with another retrospective of another season of Survivor 20 years after its initial release. I'll be talking about my thoughts on Survivor Palau, a season that I think for the most part, people do typically have a positive reception to this season. I know this season was one that was very much loved at the time that it initially aired, and felt like this breath of fresh air after Vanuatu was looked at as a bit of an underwhelming season, to where Palau was a season that I do remember fondly as a kid. It's actually the last season that I personally watched before stopping watching Survivor for a while and coming back to a Survivor Philippines, to where, again, I have fond memories of Palau. However, in the time since, I do feel like my opinions of Palau have gone down. Now, I hadn't rewatched it in a while. This is a season that went from, again, being solidly in the top half of seasons for me into one that was kind of nearing the bottom tier of seasons in my mind. Where, again, I was really interested in rewatching the season here and finally getting a more solidified opinion on it. And sadly, I do feel like my opinion does land more so towards that negative side of things. Not that this is an entirely bad season. This is a season that obviously has some really iconic moments, some really iconic characters, and actually a pretty interesting endgame stretch, but one that just feels pretty lacking, especially from the aspects of Survivor that I personally care about, where it feels like this is a season that very much focuses around challenges and the survival aspects of the show, with very little focus on strategy until the tail end of the game, which again is something that, again, I think is a bit underwhelming from my point of view. But with that, again, I will still be talking through my entire thoughts on Survivor Palau from beginning to end, and with that, let's start off with the premiere, where we do get our typical spiel from Jeff introducing the location of Palau, while also introducing us to the World War II theme that the season has, which actually ends up adding this pretty unique aesthetic to this season, way more modern than what we typically see on Survivor, with us having lots of camo and military crates and shipwrecks, and that also end up bleeding into the challenges as well. I do think this comes off as one of the most unique themes the show has ever had, and something it actually executes pretty well across its run. But also here we do get a lot of hype over how this is the first time ever we're having 20 survivors, a number that will become pretty normal in the years since, though again does continue this shifting away from the original Survivor format, where again the length of 39 days was created because specifically that was what was naturally needed for a 16-person cast and a 13 episode season, though now with them keeping the same amount of days but now having 20 people in the cast, it does force them to create these new twists and format changes to narrow down players faster, where, to be fair, the way they end up handling that on this season in particular is by fixing some of those issues from the very beginning of the season, and through that they're able to format it pretty similarly to Vanuatu, with again this being formatted very similarly to that of an 18-person cast over a 20-person cast, though again I do think it ends up leading to this trajectory of the show slipping away from what the format of the show was meant to be. Now, another thing I do want to mention here about the cast here ends up being the fact that it does feel very recruit heavy, where I do look at this season as kind of this transitional point to where Survivor started to cast a bevy of actor types that knew nothing about Survivor and didn't have much personality, and were people that were simply just cast because they were these young, attractive people. Now, obviously, we did have a few of them in previous seasons. I mean, literally in Vanuatu, we had the likes of like John Kenny and JP, but I do feel like this season feels even more filled with them. People like Jonathan and Jeff and Ibrahim and Ashley and Kim, even though I believe she did apply, but still the season ends up being really ripe with recruits to the show, many of which ending up on Oolong, which feels kind of convenient. But again, we do end up getting more recruits here than any season beforehand, with almost half of this cast here being recruited. Again, starting off this very recruit-heavy era of the show, where really up to the 30s of Survivor, the majority of Survivor casts from this point on, and it being filled with recruits, with, to be fair, way more egregious examples in the seasons to come, but I do think this is the point where you can tell the shift in how they cast the show, and I do wonder if that did stem from the fact that they obviously needed more people because it was a larger cast, and they needed to fill out those slots, and obviously the lessening amount of applicants obviously played a factor here as well. Probably actually the bigger factor for why they do this for more seasons down the road. But I do think it leads to some pretty inconsistent casts, with this being a cast that definitely felt like there were a lot of people that just felt like fodder on this season. But either way, the season does start with the players themselves rowing in a boat already together, which I do find to be a very strange way to start off this season. With them, again, not really being marooned, but again, already having this boat for the entire group to be using together. And this is where we have Jeff stopping in front of them and revealing that their new home is behind them, from a mile out, and also revealing that there are 2 immunity necklaces on shore, one for the men and one for the women, and that they are starting off the game not in tribes here. All, again, a very radically different start to this season, something that, again, was very much promoted in all the previews coming into this season, where, again, we've obviously never had, and rarely do ever again, start without any tribes being formed, where this allows for the players to spend a couple days together before the tribes end up coming together, and even after the tribes end up coming together, they're still intermixed for another day afterwards, to where, again, straight up, I don't actually mind this dynamic. It's something that I actually would like to see again, where, and this is obviously this like kind of proto One World twist, to where, again, even in One World, I don't feel like to do enough with this format, and here, again, ultimately, none of this ends up really mattering because of the oolonging, but again, I do actually think this is an interesting twist to have that, again, can set up a lot of interesting ramifications for a later merge, considering all these people have these relationships that they built from the very beginning, to where, again, I think having people from the 2 tribes being able to intermix a bit more before the merge is nothing but a good thing. But also, again, them having 2 immunity necklaces up for grabs right away ends up also being a pretty big shakeup to the typical formula here that they end up reusing for down the road, typically giving one person from each tribe immunity during their first tribal, though obviously this time it's handled in a bit of a different manner. But I do think this is a fun way to introduce our cast here, and that we obviously have, again, the players still rowing the shore together, while, again, there being this lingering tension over who's going to go for the necklaces first, which can lead to some natural characterization for our cast and how they handle this twist, which, again, I think is a very effective way to start off this season, where this also ends up being a pretty humorous opening to the season, with us first seeing Kobe instantly pop up as they're told about these immunity necklaces, only for the cast to just sit him back down. But eventually we do get our first confessional pretty late into this sequence, it being a pretty great one coming from James, who is an incredible character on this season, even though he hasn't aged particularly well, but this ends up being a really great introduction to him here by him saying, "Jeff's a son of a bitch," which might be one of the best opening confessionals for any given season. But eventually we do see Steph being the one to first jump out of the boat here, thinking that she's a good swimmer and will be able to outswim the boat. And right after her comes Jonathan as well, only for them to both fall behind, which wasn't a great introduction to them from an edit perspective, with them being shown in a pretty dodo-ish manner, which, again, is a weird way to start Stephanie's legacy in particular. But also, I do think just in general, this is a pretty bad move, where practically this just shows the other players that these are players that are thinking very individualistically, and, again, just puts this easy bullseye on their backs from the beginning, which, again, doesn't seem to end up affecting Stephanie, at least, but definitely did seem to be a factor into people's dislike of Jonathan. But again, this ends up being a pretty humorous scene of Stephanie even asking to get back on the boat, only for him to not stop for her. But eventually we do get the others arriving on shore and racing to the necklaces, with Ian being the first to get there for the men by a pretty wide margin, with James finally saying that he's a skinny boy and a fast little booger. Oh, well, Jolanda ends up barely edging out Jen for the necklace for the women's side of things. But obviously with this, we do get a lot of confusion over them not having tribes here, and the show really hyping up how the game has never started off this way. And we do see the players introducing themselves, doing the standard shelter building. But it is in this moment where I realized something that was missing from that opening scene in the version of the show that I watched, which is the version on Paramount Plus. And that missing thing is the fact that they cut out Wanda's introduction to the show, with, again, her having a scene on the boat as she's singing while they're rowing the shore, which is, again, a fun introduction to her. Also a fun introduction to Willard, with him calling her a lunatic and says that he wants to knock her off with an oar. Probably the best Willard content of the season. But again, all this gets cut from the streamable version of the show for what I assume is a rights issue due to, again, Wanda singing. But again, a shame considering this is actually a really funny moment that really just epitomizes Wanda's run on this season. And without it here, it really ends up messing with the storytelling of this opening scene, as, again, this was really the scene used to explain why Wanda's not picked. And without that, Wanda's elimination just kind of comes out of nowhere, with, again, they're not really being a proper introduction to her. But beyond that, again, we end up seeing Karen leading people around initially, which leads to our first confessional from Tom, with him coming off really perspective here, saying that he has to watch out for those going in different directions, but also noting that people are going to try to get him to do the fire, and that's a losing job. With that, then proceeding to cut to James struggling to make the fire, with, again, all this being pretty good talk from Tom of him being aware that taking the leadership position with a target on his back, which, again, would have been great if Tom actually followed any of the things he was actually saying in this moment. But it is also here where we do see Tom and Stephanie bond, with them talking about starting the first true alliance we see here. wanting to build one with Ian and also Katie, though that doesn't get mentioned during this scene for whatever reason. But this ends up being the alliance that ends up essentially running the season, just taking out Steph, which ends up being a pretty unfortunate aspect of Steph's run on this season, and that had she stayed with the likes of Tom and Ian on Koror, she probably ends up having a pretty easy ride through the season, being in this dominant alliance that runs the show, but instead she ends up having one of the most unlucky runs in Survivor history. But also here's where we get a lot of focus around Angie and Kobe, with them bonding about being different, having been ostracized, which was really endearing content to see here, them coming together, though again, none of that ends up actually mattering in the slightest. But beyond that, we do get some weird, smaller segments of people like cutting clothes and eating grasshoppers, which just felt like a waste of time, especially during the premiere here, where, again, this should have been time utilized to really set up more dynamics, especially those that would be relevant to the upcoming schoolyard pick, as by the time that ends up happening, we don't get to see much of why people picked the way they did, which is something that can make that scene come off as a bit underwhelming. We do end up getting a segment here setting up Jonathan as a target, with us seeing Kobe doing some pretty good work in setting people up to vote for him, with again him jumping out of the boat seeming to be one of the justifications. But beyond that, it just seems like he didn't really bond with anyone out there. And again, I know there's some rumors that he supposedly said some not PC things while out there that also painted a target on his back, to where, again, it very much did seem like this was pretty prime for Jonathan to be voted out had they done some massive 20-person tribal council, which it did seem like that's what the players here were assuming was going to happen. But obviously, again, it ends up being a bit different than that. But again, this is all a pretty great introduction to Kobe, with him being a pretty strong narrator throughout this season, being one of the main narrators on Koror. To where throughout this first half of the season, Kobe was the Edgic frontrunner, which again I think is fully understandable when you rewatch the season, where he has a much better edit and is also a much better character than I even remembered him being during my previous watch throughs. But this is where we then cut to the next morning, where Jeff arrives at camp, calling up the 2 immunity winners, which is where they're told that their immunity will guarantee that they stay in the game for the next 10 minutes, with the reveal that they are doing a schoolyard pick now to decide on tribes, which they had obviously previously done in Survivor Thailand, but this time it is the 2 immunity winners that get the first pick, which I actually like how this part of the twist was handled, where, again, I've always been a proponent for schoolyard picks on Survivor, as I do think it's interesting to see these social dynamics be tested, and again, we do get a lot of intrigue here from how this one plays out, even though, again, I wish it was set up a bit more, but sadly, I do think this season ends up being one of the examples utilized of why schoolyard picks on Survivor don't work, as again production's main qualm with that is that it creates these lopsided tribes, and obviously again this season does end up being pretty lopsided, though to be fair I think it is a future season that ends up being the final straw for them, which again I think more so overshadows what happens with Oolong in this spot. And also anyway, like I feel like that would be a bit unfair anyway, as I do think the schoolyard pick was not really the main reason why things did not end up working out for the Oolong tribe here, where I think it was a lot more like unlucky circumstances / poor decisions that were made after this point. But that is when we get to definitely the more controversial aspect of this twist here, in that the last man and woman not picked are automatically purged from the game, which is a twist that I'm of 2 minds on, in the sense that while it sucks for the 2 players to go home here without actually end up facing a formal vote, which in itself is obviously very different from how Survivors handled eliminations in the past, I still actually don't find this twist to be particularly unfair, where while it would have been more fair had they told the players beforehand what to expect and the players had a full day to build relationships in the lead up to this, as again, this is essentially just a test of your relationships that you were able to make over the course of the last day. Now, obviously, again, there's more nuances to that and how each person obviously picks one person who then picks the next, where again, there can be a world where you're like number 2 on most people's list, but a lower priority for the person that picks the final person, through that you're kind of screwed over in that sense, to where, again, there are definitely unlucky circumstances that can arise from this. And also, again, you're not necessarily fully inclined to pick persons solely because of social connections, as again, there's still the need for challenge strength. But again, I do think this is a spot where I don't hate this as a way to start off the season, and I do think it actually plays out pretty well in this specific spot, where more times than not, I do feel like the most expendable people of the cast end up being the ones to be eliminated here, and they would be people that would just be the first vote out anyway. Now again, I do feel for the players that get eliminated by this twist, as again, they went through all that trouble to get cast, and that's a lot of work just to be instantly eliminated from the show. show. Though again, I still don't feel like they were particularly like screwed because again, they were at the bottom of the pecking order anyway. Now, I will say from a production standpoint, I am a bit surprised they started off the season with this sort of twist, where I feel like this is a sort of twist that would never happen in the modern day, where modern survivors so worried about eliminating players early on, and they're worried there's a medevac or some sort of quit situation that forces them to affect the schedule. Again, that's a major reason why we don't see many double eliminations early on the seasons anymore. So again, I don't think that this is something they would necessarily risk in the modern day. But again, I do think this is a very interesting way to start off the season, something that is obviously extremely notable. But again, as for the pick itself, we do end up seeing Ian instantly picking Katie, who ends up picking Tom, again having that portion of the alliance be able to stick together, all while Steph ends up being picked for the other tribe before Tom is able to pick her. To where, again, in retrospect, if they were trying to keep their alliance together, probably the right call would have been for Ian to pick Stephanie, and then Stephanie picked Tom, and Tom picked Katie. I feel like that was a way they actually keep their alliance together, though, considering Ian did have an instant bond with Katie, and again, not entirely sure about how close him and Steph were from the very beginning. Again, I don't fault him, obviously, for making that decision. Though, again, here we do end up seeing a lot of the early picks, especially on Oolong, be based around physical strength, though we do also end up seeing some be based around relationships that we got no setup to, where, again, we see Greg picking Jen, we see Jeff picking Kim, we see Ashley picking Ibrahim. All these people who, again, supposedly had these, like, initial connections that we just simply did not see on the show. And I will say also, like, for Ibrahim in particular, I'm pretty shocked that he got picked so late, considering how much of a physical asset he seemed to be, and didn't seem to have anything, like, offensive about him like Jonathan. So the fact that he was essentially the second to last guy picked here is pretty shocking. But the most interesting choices here end up coming from the Karor side of things, where we do see Kobe, who, again, you would assume would pick Angie to go along with that previous setup, ends up picking Karen here instead, which isn't explained. Though, again, I know Kobe and Karen were relatively close, and he probably thought Karen was someone that would probably be an easy vote off as well, where, again, I can kind of get the rationale, but it does feel a bit weird based on how we got no focus on that relationship. But through that, we also have Karen making a pretty interesting choice here as well, with her having the final choice between Jonathan and Willard for the men, to which, from an editing perspective, it's pretty obvious she picks Willard, though at the same time, again, a very savvy move from Karen, probably the only one she makes across the entire season, that she has talked about how she picked Willard, knowing that he's someone that would be targeted over her, where otherwise she'd be perceived to be the weakest and potentially be the first boot from the tribe. And considering, again, she does have a bond with Willard as well, again, I do feel like this is a pretty good call for her game, even though, again, it can come off as questionable. Why not pick Jonathan for your tribe, which will help you in challenges? Though, again, it'll turn out fine for Karor without Jonathan. But as soon as this choice is made, we do instantly start to get this really over-the-top sorrow music playing, which really carries over as Ibrahim makes his final choice amongst the women, picking Angie over Wanda. So again, this is really propped up as this big emotional scene, which in the uncut version is followed up by Wanda singing On Her Way Out, which ends up making this actually kind of humorous, especially as we do get a annoyed reaction from Greg, which is funnily kept in the edited version as well. You just don't get to see what he's reacting to, which is all strange. But again, I know this is a twist that people did not like at the time, that people were upset that people are eliminated in this way. I do think this makes for a pretty iconic opening to this season, even though it is one that kind of harms the overall pacing of the episode as a whole. But again, with that, let's talk about the two boots here. Again, we lost Jonathan, who we didn't get much of on the show. I don't feel like we really got to know much about Jonathan outside. Again, he did not seem to be the most riveting TV character. He just seemed kind of bland. And with him also, again, not really gelling with his tribe. Again, maybe said some of the key things. I don't feel like Jonathan's someone that comes off as particularly likable here, to where, if anything, I think it's just kind of humorous that he ends up being the first boot on the season. It's about where, again, you would never expect that to happen. And then we also lose Wanda, who, again, obviously was an incredible character for the little that we got of her. Again, her singing and her annoying her tribe mates was really humorous. Now, realistically, I think Wanda, for me, is more so remembered for her being the inspiration for Wandoff on RHAP, again, a sing parody contest that they end up doing there. And so, again, that's really the first thing I think of when I think of Wanda, more so than her actual run on the season. But again, I still think her appearance on this season ended up bringing at least some humor to the show. But following this, we do still have the two tribes living at the same camp, which was pretty surprising to see here, where it did make you wonder if they were going to be doing this the entire season. But it is here where you see Ian's team being named Karor, wearing brown, a strange color to have here, though again makes sense considering the theme. But again, Karor obviously ends up becoming really iconic as one of the most dominant tribes in Survivor history, but they do largely come off as unassuming at first here, being dubbed the older tribe, though Ian ends up calling them wiser, while Jolanda's team ends up being called Oolong, a tribe now synonymous with disaster tribes. Though again, they aren't aren't initially portrayed as that disaster. They're instead portrayed as these overdogs, a tribe containing the young bucks. Though also coming off very overconfident in that, to where from a pure Edgic perspective, I felt like that should have made it very obvious that Kror was probably more primed for success here, probably contained the winner as well, with them again being portrayed in a more rootable light from the start, with Oolong's content feeling a lot more negative. But with that, we get to the immunity challenge, which also serves as a reward challenge as well, but in a bit of an interesting way here, where it ends up being a standard obstacle course challenge with a minor twist to it. That being that they are given a bevy of survival items at the beginning of the course that they get to keep if they take those items throughout the entire course, though that obviously adds this interesting dilemma of how much do you bring, as bringing more items obviously makes it a lot more difficult to get through the course, which also can waste time as you also have to untie all these items, and again, also the decision making on what exactly you bring can end up wasting time as well, where again, there's this really major risk reward dilemma here, especially as only the winning tribe here ends up getting to keep what they take, and all of which being a very fun twist to this opening challenge here that ends up paying off in some pretty fun dividends, where we do see Kror do the sensible move of just taking fire, allowing for them to get through the course pretty quickly, all while Oolong wastes so much time trying to take as much as they can, and us seeing them argue over this, with Steph being annoyed at Yolanda, who's leading the tribe during this challenge, and all only for them to just struggle throughout the course anyway with all the items that they're carrying. And also even then, the items that they end up selecting here ends up having some poor decisions as well, with them taking food and water but not fire somehow, and we even later see them rowing in the wrong direction, again all giving us this glimpse into how train wrecky Oolong is going to end up being, where again they ultimately end up losing the challenge here, the first of many losses across the season. But following this, we do get to see Kror being given the immunity idol, which looks notably just like Willard, which is a really funny coincidence there. But also it is here where we get the reveal that they will no longer be staying at the same beaches, because obviously that would have made it pretty dumb for them to do this entire challenge to get these supplies only for them to be able to share them anyway. But with Kror winning the challenge, they ultimately get the choice of which beach to live on. Either go back to their original camp, which is again fully set up, they had worked on for 3 days, or go to a brand new one, which would have been really dumb. And we see in future seasons when this is an option through tribe swaps, we see tribes despair at the concept of going to a new camp, and what do you know, we see Tom taking the leadership position here despite him saying he wasn't going to, and proceeding to make the decision to go to a new beach, where again supposedly other members of the tribe also want to do this. But I do feel like this is such a ridiculous idea, where again as we see with Kror Beach ends up being again the lesser of the two. But again, just in general, why go for the unknown when your original beach is fine as is, and again already fully prepared? So again, having to go to a new camp and start a new shelter really just makes this decision such a ridiculous one, and we do end up seeing them instantly regret this, with the rest of the content from Kror ends up being again a bit negative tinged here, as on their way to their camp, their boat ends up capsizing, during which they end up losing their supplies that they had just won, with it falling to the bottom of the sea, ending this episode with them looking like a bit of a disaster tribe in their own right, though obviously they end up completely turning this around. Meanwhile, on Oolong, we do continue to focus a lot on Angie, with her getting a mini journey edit kind of across this season. But again, we get to see her being a bit upset over how Kobe didn't pick her, and how she's now at the bottom of her tribe, which I mean, to be fair, again, from an edit perspective, not the greatest content for Kobe, especially considering how that kind of contradicts that initial relationship that was set up between them. But obviously, again, this is all just to really set up Angie as the red herring for this episode, all while we see her frustrations at Yolanda for what happened at the challenge, only for Yolanda to also end up being extremely domineering around camp, telling them that they should take an hour rest for every 2 hours they work, which didn't seem like anything too crazy, but people did not take that too well, all while we see her being very confident that she has the votes against Angie, with her having Bobby John and Ibrahim at least on board. And we do see her also trying to get Steph on board, only for Steph to be upset at Yolanda as well for losing them the challenge, to where we see her campaigning to Bobby John, which is seemingly ineffective, which kind of becomes a trend of us seeing the two try to work together, yet just neither of them end up budging on what they want to initially do. But finally, we get a short scene of the majority agreeing to vote out Yolanda, again, right before Tribal, with, again, this entire sequence just feeling very rushed, where considering this episode was only a normal 60-minute one, it is pretty mind-blowing how much they end up fitting into this one episode, though through that, again, I think it does very much harm the scrambling here, with, again, a lot of it just coming up really underdeveloped, though. Either way, we got the tribal where James says that this is a damn fine tribe and that they're gonna win some matches, just not today, during which a ding noise plays, which, again, technically, I mean, they did end up winning rewards, but again, this is made to be this really ironic statement, as obviously ultimately they never end up winning an immunity challenge. And this starts this really funny trend on this season of everything James says ends up being wrong, which plays into how fun of a character he can end up being down the road. But obviously the vote ends up culminating in a Jolanda blindside, a 6-3 vote, which ends up being a questionable choice for the Oolong tribe, to where, again, while they are looked at as the stronger tribe, taking out one of your strongest competitors during the first vote of the season ends up, again, not sounding optimal. Now, realistically, I don't think this is actually what ended up dooming Oolong, as I think that comes a bit later, but I do think this start here was definitely not a great sign for their overall longevity. But either way, with that, we ended up losing Jolanda, who, again, I thought was fine in this one episode. Obviously, again, a very fast-paced episode, not much time to really develop Jolanda as a character, and through that, we end up seeing her in a very one-note way of her just being this very domineering presence. I know she's spoken out post-show that she felt like she was edited more negatively than what she deserved, where, again, I do think Jolanda, again, sadly ends up being portrayed here in a very stereotypical way and ends up not being particularly flattering, though at the same time, considering she is the first boot of the season and in a spot where everything was so rushed, I do feel like it would have been very difficult to edit her a different way and make her boot make sense. And I do think she still comes off as a pretty subpar player. I mean, one that, again, at least had some people wanting to keep her in Bobby John and Ibrahim, but also, again, having the entire tribe turn on you despite the fact that you are clearly the strongest woman on this tribe, I think is definitely a negative there. But again, I think Jolanda ends up being a pretty notable first boot, even though it might not be for the most flattering reasons. But with that, we then move on to episode 2, where Koror's content largely revolves around their poor living conditions, with them still having no fire and also having a camp now surrounded by rats, which they constantly hear at night, which would have been really disturbing. But this is where we do get some focus on Karen and her being upset at Tom for taking the leadership role and making the mistake of taking this new camp, to where we see her confronting him. And all this feels very contradictory to Tom's intro, already in him, again, having taken this leadership role and getting flack over it, though it is followed by Katie scolding Karen and calling her annoying, to where realistically I do think this is actually more so used to just show Karen in a more negative light and setting up this Karen-Katie rivalry. But anyway, we get to the reward challenge, which ends up continuing this underdog story for Koror, with them telling Probst about how they lost the fire, and Ian ends up calling them the bad news bears. And while the reward here ends up also coming with Flint, they end up losing the challenge here, with this challenge really emphasizing the talk that we got in the previous episode about how Oolong is the more physically stronger tribe, as this is a challenge that has them going out one by one on an obstacle course, with the other tribe being able to throw bags to knock them off along the way, which is, again, a very notable challenge from my point of view, which does lead to really funny content from Bobby John freaking out as a bag hits him. And just in general, I do love Bobby John in challenges, of him acting like a maniac here, hitting himself after scoring a point, with Jeff funnily saying that Bobby John is beating himself up as a reward. But ultimately, a major reason why Koror ends up losing here is because Katie ends up taking so much time during her run, giving Oolong a pretty massive lead, with Angie in particular doing pretty well to progress her arc, and letting this be one of the few challenges that Oolong wins across their Survivor career. But following this, we do get our final scene from Koror of the episode, which is essentially just the culmination of their underdog content up to this point, and us seeing Ian finally being able to get the Flint from the bottom of the sea, and us getting this pretty big celebration at camp as Tom lights up the fire, which he said he wasn't going to do last episode. But again, this feeling like this comeback moment for them, again, feeling very symbolic of them getting their groove back, to where, again, from this point on, while they, again, lose a reward challenge here or there, they do end up being this pretty dominant force for really the rest of the season. But again, the rest of the content here ends up revolving around Oolong, who obviously do end up having a lot of focus just in general during the early portions of this season, obviously due to their losing streak, which does lead to a weirdly balanced edit on this season, and that this season does largely feel like a season of two halves. The first revolving around Oolong, while the other half obviously having to revolve around Koror, which leads the season feeling a bit disjointed by the end, with very little of what happens early on in this season ends up mattering to the season's results, with these early episodes feeling like the Oolong show with, again, a brief look at what's happening at Koror, leaving a lot of the Koror tribe being very under-edited, despite the fact that there are the characters that we're meant to be caring about by the end of the season. But anyway, the Oolong content starts with them talking about how the Jolanda vote was a good decision, as now they don't have to follow a leader, which, again, surely will work out for them. But it is here where we do get a lot of praise for Angie's challenge performance, with talk about her making herself a valuable asset, which, again, felt like this great development for a strong journey edit that strangely doesn't end up really leading to much by the end of her run. But here we do obviously get some focus on them using the fishing gear they had just won, where, again, this season does end up having a larger focus on the survival aspects of the show, along with a heavy focus on challenges as well, which, again, typically are not aspects of the show that I particularly care for. And again, that does have an impact on my general opinion of the season, especially as we really do not get much focus on the strategic dynamics of the Oolong tribe here. And to be fair, it feels like some of that is just because they were just such a mess, where it doesn't seem like there were ever any true alliances on Oolong, and more so just these pairings that were keeping each other safe, but none of those being consistently working together, and more so them just being this collective that was voting out people based around physical strength or who was working hard around camp. That, again, just made the strategy of Oolong pretty rudimentary, despite there actually being a decent amount of chaos at points, with just people just not being able to get on the same page. But here we do get some setup, the two potential targets coming into the upcoming vote. First, seeing Ashley struggling while out there, refusing to eat the clams that they had caught, and not working around camp, with her clearly being sick, which does end up putting this big bullseye on her back, despite the fact that she actually did seem pretty close to the likes of Stephanie and Angie, and were seemingly the ones that were leading the previous vote against Jolanda, where it does seem like Ashley does become a big target here just simply because she's sick, where otherwise I do think she probably would have had a decent standing in the game. Meanwhile, we do get a lot of focus around Kim and Jeff, with them starting a showmance here, instantly getting clocked by the others and becoming a major talking point on the Oolong tribe. We talk about two-person alliances are very strong, with this obviously being a direct reaction to Rob and Amber on All Stars, which was obviously very recent for the players here, with this season being filmed mid-airing of Vanuatu, to which they hadn't even seen a full season since Rob and Amber dominated All Stars. And through that, it does end up elevating the targets on Jeff and Kim's backs, with worry about how they're going to be a new Romber, which is funny considering it's Jeff and Kim, probably the most forgettable showmans in Survivor history. But anyway, we do get to the immunity challenge, where we do see the tribes being given Morse code before it. They have them memorized for the final puzzle of the challenge, with Oolong creating this system of each player having to memorize their own share, which doesn't end up mattering as they don't even get to the puzzle, with Koror just really demolishing them in this challenge, encompassing of them having to go underwater and pull a locker back to shore before ultimately doing the Morse code puzzle, where somehow Oolong ends up really sucking here to the point where they don't even come close to finishing the first portion of the challenge before Koror ends up winning it, with Probst constantly calling out Kim for not having gone down, where it did seem pretty clear across this season that Probst wasn't a big Kim fan. And again, her poor challenge performance here did definitely increase the target that was already on Kim's back. But again, the vote ends up being one that ultimately comes down to Ashley and Kim, where we do end up seeing Ashley having a pretty solid backing initially, having her core group of Stephanie and Angie, but also having James seemingly being with them, with him essentially being the most anti-Kim presence on this season, with James continuing his streak here of being wrong and him saying that Kim is gone for sure. But it is here where we do see Jeff fighting back in this spot, leading the vote against Ashley, trying to get James on board, though realistically it didn't seem to be that effective. Though again, the show does seemingly try to give him some credit for this, even though again, it doesn't really seem like anything he does end up actually working. But again, we do end up seeing Bobby John wanting Ashley out here as well, campaigning to Stephanie, and proceeding to say that he isn't worried about the Jeff and Kim relationship, which, I mean, to be fair, considering how, again, seemingly no one ended up liking Kim, and Jeff was someone that had very little influence, I don't think Jeff and Kim are really that much of a threat anyway, especially in comparison to Romber, who had, again, Boston Rob, who was a very influential player in the game, and Amber, who was pretty well liked socially. But again, this is a spot where both Bobby John and Stephanie do seem seem unwilling to budge here, with us getting talk about how it might be a 4-4 tie, which again seems to be the assumption for a lot of this round, even though practically I don't think a 4-4 would have ever happened, as again that is implying that Ibrahim is on board to want Ashley out, which as we see by the vote itself, I don't think he ever was going to, with again him and Ashley supposedly being very close, with her being the one to save him during the schoolyard pick, and it does lead to him being again seemingly unwilling to even vote for Ashley, even in a spot where she's already going home, to where had Ashley's 4 stuck together, it would have been at worst a 4-3-1 vote, but again they ultimately don't end up going through with that, more so because Ashley essentially quits in this spot, where again due to her sickness it did seem like she just didn't really have the motivation to stay out there, in a spot where again I do think she would have had the numbers on her side, but instead she ends up relenting to where her own side ends up agreeing to vote her out, to where again I think had Ashley not gotten sick, and again she had the motivation to be there, where again who knows, maybe her being sick was just a justification for her allowing people to vote her out and she just didn't want to be there at all to begin with, but again I do think there's a world where Ashley is a competent enough player, one that again had allies in the game, had people that wanted to keep her around, and likely survives this vote, to where again I think because that Ashley ends up being someone that I look at as one of the better second boots on the board, as again I do think she would have potentially had more longevity had she just not been sick in this spot. And beyond that, we do get a pretty short sequence revolving around Kim being told by Stephanie that she's on the chopping block, which I do very much question, like, why is Steph doing this, where again this is just such a poor play from her, especially as she's one of the people fighting for Ashley to stay, which again I assume that this is a moment that happened after the decision that everyone was going to vote Ashley out, but it did feel like very sloppy play from Steph, of her again just potentially coming off as very two-faced, and does lead to Kim getting very paranoid here and starting to scramble, though again none of that really matters. It's not like she does anything to really shake up the vote or solidify any relationships, because again it's Kim. But again this did end up adding to her being the red herring for the episode, though again we never actually even see anyone outside of Stephanie's group ever consider switching their votes, to where again it felt pretty apparent where this was going. But again we get the tribal, where we do get lots of talk around Jeff and Kim, and Probst fondly scolding them for being such a blatant duo, and Kim saying that never even crossed her mind, with this being a trial pretty ripe with spicy Jeff moments. But again the vote comes off as expected here, with the majority of the tribe voting out Ashley, though again Ibrahim ends up voting for Kim, as again he's unwilling to vote for Ashley, while Ashley ends up voting for Jeff, which again I think makes it pretty clear that she was just resigned to going home here, as she doesn't even go along with her side's plan. But either way, with that we end up losing Ashley, who again doesn't bring much to the show. I don't feel like we get that much Ashley content on the season, even though again she did seem to be pretty integral into getting the votes onto Yolanda. We just simply don't really get much content from her personal perspective through that, and then by the time she has a little bit more focus in the second episode, she's essentially in a spot where she's sick and wants to quit, to where again there wasn't really much to get from Ashley. And I think in general Ashley's like one of the more forgettable Survivor players, though I think kind of has become a little bit of a meme in that sense, to where I feel like when people talk about the most forgettable Survivor players, I feel like a lot of people do mention Ashley Ashby, which in itself makes her not as forgettable, so that's something. But again, someone that I do think is probably a little bit understated as a player that again has potential. Now again I don't know if she would have ever lived up to it, and again considering she's on New Long, she's probably screwed either way, but I do think there is a world where Ashley can find herself in a majority and probably make a pretty deep run on the season. This is just not the season for her. But now moving on to episode 3, which starts off with an opening scene on Oolong that was pretty humorous, and us getting to see them talking about how annoyed Probst was at them, which again funny to see a moment this meta around this point in Survivor, a point where we do know from early on that Jeff would get upset at players for referring to the fact that they were on a TV show, to where I find it funny that we get this segment of here of them complaining about the host of the show and how hard he was on them, with Kim proceeding to say that Probst didn't like what she had to say about being in a 2-person alliance, and proceeds to talk as if like he shouldn't be annoyed at them because it's not strategy, when it's like, yeah, that's the point, that's what he's annoyed at. But this does lead to some questionable content from James proceeding to talk about his worries over Kim and Jeff and how soon they'll be making out, which then transitions to just him being outright misogynistic, with him saying Kim is a woman and all she has to her advantage is her sexuality, which again he makes comments like this all the time. Hasn't aged well. But beyond that, Karor, we do get some brief content about how bad their shelter is, leading to Kobe complaining about his tribe, which we get a lot of on this season, but here he ends up talking about how people are getting on his nerves as he can't get rid of them, with this really becoming a major through line in Kobe's game, with his game really disintegrating seemingly just because he's so annoyed at the others. But this does transition to what is more of the Katie-Karen feud, and what ends up being pretty negative content for both of them, with Katie coming off as bossy while Karen ends up coming off a bit crazy, where it really does start with Katie bossing Karen around, with Karen calling her outspoken and tart in confessional, only for us to then see her telling Katie that she's had it, lashing out at Katie while they were away from their other tribe members, which is really a funny scene here. Again, Karen just calling her out for making these snotty comments, and ends up mocking her voice, saying don't tell me what to do, and she's done hearing it, says you're on me and get off me, and storms off, which is interlaced with some really funny Katie confessionals of her talking about how she just couldn't stop laughing and how she's crazy, with the edit really playing up the ridiculousness of this scene, seemingly taking Katie's side here, where I do know Katie at the time alongside Kobe were looked at as these edgic frontrunners on the season, and I think you fully see why with Kobe, with him being such a major narrator and such a major underdog on this season, while Katie's edit here is a bit more up and down to me, to where she does still get some negative SPV somewhat consistently on the season, which, I mean, to be fair, isn't completely damning, as we did see someone like a Jenna Maraska go on to win despite having a very negative edit. But again, I do think I would have always felt like something was off here with Katie, to where I don't think I ever would have thought that she was someone that was poised to win from the edit. Though we do end this scene with more content from Karen's perspective, where do you hear her say that her doing this now runs the risk of her being voted out because she's being confrontational, which is in this very funny dichotomy of Karen, and that she seems to be pretty self-aware in the game, again, seemingly knowing her position in the game, but also doesn't seem to care and just causes conflict despite knowing that's bad for her game. But the rest of the content on Koror revolves around the survival aspects of the show, again, my favorite. But we do get a lot of focus here on Tom and Ian hunting for food and catching a sea snake, only for them to then use that as bait for a nearby shark that they don't end up catching. But Tom does say here that we will get that shark, which, again, I wonder if that's foreshadowing for 4 episodes down the road, which I do find it very strange how apart these two sequences end up being. But again, this ends up obviously being a very strong segment for Tom in particular, though despite this, Tom himself was never really looked at as a top contender to win the game until nearing the quote-unquote merge, where, again, I do think a lot of Tom's edit here does come off very abnormal for a winner at this point in Survivor, where, again, the show hadn't had a winner in this like leadership position from the very beginning, and one that was portrayed in a mostly positive way, where obviously we had someone like a Brian Heidick, though even Brian Heidick, again, had a much more negative tinged edit, and also one that was more subdued on the show, to where, again, I do get why the edge community at the time was very hesitant to assess Tom highly, especially considering, again, his contradictory content that he got early on, with him feeling more in line with a player that would just come up short than the actual winner. But anyway, we do get to the reward challenge, where we do get the first appearance of what is now a iconic challenge, where they have to fight for a ring in the water and bring it to their tribe's pontoon. And again, a really physical challenge here, with this season really upping the physicality of challenges, with a decent chunk of them allowing for physical contact, which again makes sense considering the war theme of the season, but does seemingly influence the show to really incorporate a lot more physicality in their challenges, with that becoming a pretty big staple of the teens of Survivor. And really, I do think this might end up being the strongest season for Survivor from a challenge perspective, having many challenges that are still notable to this day, many of which we don't see on the show anymore, with many of these actually being more common in Australian Survivor than Survivor US. But again, I do find it funny how the show does take the time here to explain the boundaries here pertaining to how far you can go in physical challenges, saying that you could do whatever as long as it's not punching or intentionally hurting people, with Jeff talking about how it is still a social game and you have to keep that in mind, that the people you're competing against are people that you need the votes of, which, I mean, not really on this season, but again, they do end up making a pretty big deal of this, all while I will also mention the fact that I do find it funny how physical of a challenge this is just to win a sewing kit, which is such a lame reward, but they do seemingly end up being really excited for it for whatever reason. But either way, this ends up being another challenge that Oolong ends up easily overpowering Koror in, winning another reward, which again, if only they could translate that into immunities. But on Oolong, we do get some focus here on Bobby John, who does get strong content in this episode, where we do see the tribe not knowing what to do with the sewing kit, to which Bobby John ends up using some of the material they got to make a line for fishing, and we do see him catching some small fish, and then proceed to crack some coconuts, all while we see the others lazing around, with this really giving Bobby John this reputation as the hardest working survivor, which does end up being a major aspect of his legacy, where, I mean, obviously nowadays we do remember him more so for being on Oolong, but I do feel like his reputation coming into Guatemala was about how much of an asset he was in the survival aspects of the game, though this scene ends up also being used to further dunk on Kim, with her just watching Bobby John work and proceeding to complain about how he's constantly working. But following that, we do get some content revolving around Jeff, where he ends up having to use the bathroom at night, and in the process ends up rolling his ankle, to where we do see him struggling to walk the next morning, with this having Oolong now have debatably their strongest competitor injured and incapable of competing in challenges that involve walking, where again, to follow up on I talked about previously, I do think this is probably the point of no return for Oolong here, the moment where I think it would have been very difficult for them to recover from, where again, I don't think it's a coincidence that once Jeff gets injured here and ultimately ends up leaving, that this is the point where they even stop to win even reward challenges, where again, like up to this point, Oolong was the stronger tribe in terms of physical challenges, but once Jeff ends up being injured here, they even start to lose those. Now, to be fair, beyond this, there are a good chunk of non-physical competitions as well, and obviously, even with Jeff, they were losing up to this point, but I do think Jeff was a major asset for them in challenges, with Jeff seemingly being the only one that was able to be competitive with Tom, even beating Tom in that previous reward challenge, where again, I do think Jeff was their strongest assets, and without him, it really leaves them being severely outmatched in many of the upcoming challenges, though to be fair, I mean, they probably would have lost them anyway. Anyway, we get to the immunity challenge, which ends up being, again, the first appearance of another iconic challenge, Hot Pursuit, where this has the two tribes chasing each other while carrying weights, and people can drop out but have to give their weights to their fellow tribe members. And again, a really iconic challenge here, and always a fun one that I'm shocked we don't see more in modern Survivor, considering not even that physical, but I feel like this wouldn't be that difficult for them to do. But again, because of Jeff's injury, we do see him having to drop out from the challenge right away, which ends up pretty much dooming Oolong, especially when from the offset, with Tom once again getting shown very positively here and him really leading Karor to this win. But it's here after the immunity challenge where we do instantly see Jeff telling his tribe that there's no way that he can get to the end on a busted ankle, saying that it'll take 3 weeks for him to get better, and essentially just tells his tribe to vote him out, which I do think is really lame here from Jeff's point of view, that he just didn't even care enough to play this all out, as again, even an injured Jeff in this spot is probably still better than Kim in most given challenges, but he seemingly just throws in the towel right away here, which does very much make me feel like he was already feeling defeated and just wanted a way out, and this is just his excuse for leaving the game, as again, his tribe wanted him to stay, and if he had wanted to stay, he would have stayed here, and it very much just felt like he was kind of just giving up at the first opportunity to do so. But again, despite this, we do still see talk about voting for Kim, despite his wishes, particularly from the men of the tribe, though we do end up seeing Angie instantly being on board with taking out Jeff, which I assume was to keep another woman in the game, as we do end up seeing Angie being someone that in particular that was very much worried of the men outnumbering her and staff if Kim goes. And to be fair, I think is probably the right call for Angie, as obviously if they're outnumbered, again, she's more likely to go than Steph. While if Kim is there, Kim is essentially a shield for her that protects her in the game. So again, I think this is a pretty good call for Angie's longevity in the game. And this did lead to a pretty humorous scene to me of Bobby John, again, being very much in the camp of wanting Jeff to stay and tries to convince Angie to change her mind, which his way of doing that is to watch Jeff from a distance as he's cutting coconuts, which again, he impressively is able to cut them open with a single slice. Though despite this, we see Angie not changing her mind, and we see Bobby John just being disappointed in that, with this very much feeling like a little kid trying to convince their parent to buy them something, only to be disappointed when they get shut down. But either way, we get the tribal where we do get talk from Bobby John about how Tom is a man among men, which again, strong SPV for Tom there. I'll always see the rest of the tribal revolving around Jeff wanting to quit, saying that he's doing so as he's a team player and he wants to better the tribe by taking himself out, with Probst clearly being annoyed at this, with him literally looking at it as a situation of Jeff just engineering a quit. And again, I do actually agree with Probst in this spot. I do feel like Jeff is very much in the spot where I think he wants to quit. He is now trying to pretend like he's doing this for the better of Oolong to cover that up, which, again, I've always said this in the past, like, I don't mind people quitting the game, personally. Again, I get why you would quit Survivor. It's obviously a very difficult game to play. What does annoy me more so is when you quit, but then pretend like you don't want to quit, and you're doing this because you're a team player, which is just complete nonsense. But again, we get to the votes, and obviously the votes end up going his way, though not unanimously in the way that you would expect, where we do end up seeing Jeff here voting for James, which isn't explained, though also we end up seeing Bobby John and James end up voting for Kim in this spot, which did seem pointless, as again, they obviously must have known that Jeff was going, and their votes wouldn't have mattered in this spot, and really all this is doing is just pissing off Kim for no reason. But either way, with that, we end up losing Jeff, and again, I already kind of said my piece on him. I feel like he's someone that, again, essentially quits the game, and I do think his quit ends up really sinking Oolong here, where from this point forward, again, I don't think there really was a path for Oolong to take control back of the game, and when also adding in the fact that Jeff Wilson is just such a boring presence on the show, something that doesn't really bring anything to the table. Something I also don't even know if he knew a single thing about Survivor coming into the season. To where, again, I think really the most notable things about him are the fact that, again, quits the game, and also the fact that he had a showmance that's one of the most forgettable showmances in Survivor history. To where, again, I don't think Jeff Wilson ends up being a particularly notable player here, and one that ends up being kind of just annoying to watch, considering how he exits the game. But either way, we then move on to episode 4, which starts on Oolong, where who would have guessed it? They talk about how they keep losing and how they can't turn it around, which essentially ends up being them every episode from this point on. But eventually both tribes end up getting tree mail telling them to pick a representative for their tribes, with us getting some tension on Karor, with Tom appointing Ian as that representative, with Kobe voicing his annoyances how Karen and Janu didn't get picked despite them volunteering, and says that he's on the bottom and that he's the underdog, which again I do think continues this trajectory of getting this strong narrational content that paints Tom and Ian not in the greatest lights, where I do think at this point in the season, again, I would have been 100% under the assumption that Kobe was going to go on to win the game, and if not win the game, then at least get the better of Tom and Ian, which obviously just simply doesn't happen. Or instead, he just like constantly trashes on them just for him to lose to them, and then them go on to dominate the season, which is just a very strange aspect of how the season's edited. But as expected on the Oolong side of things, we do see them being a complete disaster during the decision making here, where we do see James and Kim wanting Steph to be the representative, only for her to not want anything to do with it, and they end up again just deciding to not make a decision, which is funny, as when Jeff arrives at their camp for their decision, he's clearly annoyed at how they haven't picked anyone yet, which is where we do get the reveal of what the reward challenge is, which is a bathroom building competition sponsored by Home Depot, which again, these style challenges end up being a pretty big staple of this era of the show, though also do make the survival aspects of the game even easier, with them now having a fully functioning bathroom and tools given to them by Home Depot. Well, also the winning tribe here gets a pretty insane reward of them having a full shelter built for them by the Survivor construction department, which felt very strange that on a season that's so reliant on the survival aspects of the show that they just end up being handed some of the best living conditions the show has ever had. And again, this ends up being a massive advantage for Karor, who obviously ends up winning this challenge here, further increasing the gap between the two tribes. Though I will say, I don't particularly love the fact that they were allowed to pick their representatives after Jeff arrived, as obviously when Jeff arrives, it becomes very clear what style challenge is going to be, which does lead to Oolong picking James, as again, James works in construction. But this does lead to a funny little moment that I've always loved, where they're allowed to pick which tools they want to use, to which when the tools here are revealed, James just yells out, "My stuff," in a really over-the-top way, which I always found really funny. But also on Karor, we do end up seeing the Ian pick play pretty well for them as well, and the fact that he had family that was in construction. And while we do see Karor, and while Karor is working on their bathroom, we continue to get pretty strong SPV for Tom, with him getting propped up as this good leader and Willard calling him the motor that makes the train run. which is funny that Tom is getting this content while Ian is the one that's supposed to be leading this challenge. But again, on Oolong, we essentially get the opposite of that, with focus on James and how Steph and Angie and Kim end up being annoyed at his leadership, all while we do get some focus on Bobby John, which ends up being very strange content over him saying how he puts his whole body and soul into it, and he has to want it, and that's what winners do. They keep fighting and persevering, which again kind of sums up his story outside of the winner part of it, and it is further emphasized by him proceeding to cut down a tree only for the tree to get stuck and him not being able to pull it down, leading to him having to cut another one, which was kind of humorous. But eventually we do have Jeff arriving at the camps alongside their judge from the construction department, that being Jesse Jensen, which is so strange to see here because if you do not know, Jesse Jensen is currently one of the executive producers of the show alongside Jeff. Where again, seeing him get a cameo here, again, decades beforehand, and as being one that I completely forgot about was very strange to see here. And here we end up already seeing Jeff really gooning over Tom, propping up how good of a tour guide he is, and clearly Crore ends up having the edge here, with Oolong not even being finished with theirs by the time that Jeff arrives, and while Oolong ends up actually putting together an admirable performance here, and clearly they themselves thought they were going to win, with James saying that there's no doubt that they won, which clearly means that that wasn't going to happen. And what do you know? Crore ends up winning. And again, it was just so surreal to see this like crew arriving at their camp and building them this like really well-made shelter, and also like giving them a hammock, champagne, and a picnic table, which it just felt like such an over-the-top reward here that greatly improved Crore's quality of life to give them, again, just an even bigger advantage in this game where, again, they already had a pretty massive lead before this. But following this, we don't get much time for camp life before the immunity challenge, outside of us seeing Oolong moping about their loss, with James saying that this just makes them even angrier, and that they're gonna run through Crore like a bulldozer. And what do you know? James is wrong again. This ends up taking us to another first appearance of an iconic immunity challenge, this one being Sumo at Sea, which obviously has players facing off head to head and only being able to hit each other with these bags that they hold in front of them. Again, an instant classic here that probably does provide some more notable moments down the road, but this ends up being a fun instance of the challenge that does have some notable moments here where we do have seen the men of Crore clearly outclass those of Oolong, with Tom beating Bobby John here twice. Kobe ends up beating James here twice, which ultimately ends up giving them the win by the end. It also leads to one of James's most iconic moments here, which was a humorous moment at the time of James saying that it feels terrible to have your butt whipped by a homosexual, that those gay folk are strong and work out at the gym, which again hasn't aged well, but the fact that he culminates this line and just having to mention the fact that they work out at the gym is so ridiculous here. Though, again, obviously, as a whole, still a very homophobic comment. But again, we do end up seeing the Oolong women performing pretty well here, giving this glimmer of hope that they can pull out the win. Again, in a spot where I do think having a fully powered Jeff here would have probably given them the edge over Crore in this specific spot. But here we do end up seeing Steph beating Jen twice, while Angie ends up finally beating Karen, leading to a great moment from her of her yelling that you're going back to immunity, and then corrects herself saying tribal council, with Jeff saying that she's so excited that she doesn't know what to say, which again is fun here, and also again, just even then makes no sense. Again, even if Angie did say what she meant to say and that you're going back to tribal council, again, they never have gone to tribal council. Either way, this statement is ridiculous. But ultimately Oolong loses again, with Steph saying that she's never lost this bad in her entire life, with a lot of the blame here going towards James to set up James's potential boots, even though it felt pretty apparent that was just going to be an easy Kim vote. Though again, we do end up seeing James coming off pretty negatively here, telling Kim that they're not going to talk game and just write a name down with us, then cutting to him saying that she's gone, which to be fair is one of the few times he's actually right on this season. But again, we do get to see the women being upset at how he's talking to them, with Steph and Angie considering saving her, where again they do end up being worried about the three guys sticking together, to where I do think there was some reason to that, and the fact that all three of the guys here all came from Alabama somehow, which I really do not get how they cast three guys from Alabama on this season. They all ended up on the same tribe and ended up being the last three of their tribe. But again, we do end up ultimately seeing the women not go through with this, as at this point best they could do is cause a tie, which I don't think they looked at this situation as dire enough, and to be fair, it wasn't until Twist comes around and screws them over. But anyway, we get the tribal where Jeff continues to be pretty harsh on Oolong, saying that he saved their seats from last time and really just hammers home how badly they are getting beat by Karor, and proceeds to call out Kim once again for not doing anything, with Jeff coming off a bit questionable here, saying that if there weren't any men on your tribe, would you survive through this? Which does lead to Steph saying, I can, which I guess is a bit of foreshadowing there. But again, we do ultimately get a unanimous Kim vote, which was pretty predictable. And through that, again, we lose Kim, who I do think ends up being one of the more forgettable players in Survivor history. Where, again, I think the most notable aspect of Kim's run this season is the fact that she had this showmance with Jeff, and even that, again, is not particularly notable. And also, I'll say Kim is seemingly a really terrible player as well, one that did nothing to really make herself look like a potential asset for her tribe. And obviously, again, there's these inherent biases that are definitely there, but we get so many shots of Kim just like not doing anything around camp while we see other people working around her. And I feel like Kim's like a type of player that did not really have much potential on this season. Though I do know that she's someone that still follows the show and was like talking about wanting to play again in recent years, where again, maybe now later in life she would be better at the game. But again, ultimately on this season, she really did not bring much to the table. But with that, we then get to episode 5, which does start with content from Karor, with Greg and Jen finally being on the show in a spot where Jen had been pretty invisible up to this point, and does end up ultimately being severely under-edited across this season, having one of the quietest edits of any Survivor up to this point in the show's history. But it is here where she's finally on the show, because her and Greg are in the showmans, again, cuddling at night, and the others end up noticing, where, again, I'm a bit surprised they didn't go a bit more ham on this relationship, as, again, Romber had just happened a few seasons ago and was a massive success for the show. So again, I think Jeff and Kim being overshadowed makes a lot of sense, considering, again, clearly they didn't like them. But I think Greg and Jen are two people that it does seem like production like to a degree, though obviously neither of them were the greatest characters in the world. And considering how obviously Tom and Ian and Colby and even like Karen and Katie were more blatantly bigger characters on this season, I guess it just leaves Greg and Jen just largely overshadowed by the end of it, especially as like neither of them are particularly relevant to the ultimate result of the season. But also it is here where we do get some focus on Willard, showing him seemingly isolating himself, sleeping in the hammock away from the others, and also showing him being told to tend to the fire, only for it to go out under his watch, with Tom and Greg being annoyed here, saying that he's getting a free ride and playing the game longer than he should, which, I mean, does feel like them being on a bit of a high horse. But I mean, truly, Willard does end up surviving here way longer than what he normally would, where I do think on most given seasons he is an early boot, with him just seeming to be a grump out there and not even trying to bond with most members of his tribe, despite how he recognizes the power structure of the tribe. And in many ways, he does very much remind me of B.B. Anderson in this moment, and that he's, again, clearly a very intelligent guy, but just realizes none of that to actually navigate through the game. So again, it felt very clear that Willard was set up to be the first one out of Karor if they were ever lose immunity, or I guess in this case, not even lose immunity. But it's also here where we get content on Oolong, showing them being completely dysfunctional once again, and us seeing it pouring after Tribal, where we see the tribe trying to evacuate to a nearby cave, again, in the middle of the night as it's pouring, where we do finally see them getting lost, and James trying to prop this up as this big adventure for them to go on, with Angie just clearly being annoyed and going back to the camp on her own, with James getting upset at her for quitting, which might not be the last time he does something like that, and it leads to Angie talking about how miserable they are, which essentially ends up being the last Angie content we get on this season, with her upcoming boot really coming out of nowhere, to where she doesn't really get a satisfying conclusion to her story, which I do find very strange, considering how much the early edit of the show seemed to be setting up this journey for her to go on, only for her story to kind of end very prematurely. But again, we get to the challenge where we do get the reveal that tonight both tribes will end up going to tribal, this again being another double elimination, which again we saw in Vanuatu, even technically saw in Pearl Islands, which again I already talked about my thoughts on just the general premise of double eliminations back in my Vanuatu retrospective. But I do think having this style of double elimination is something that I'm not entirely opposed to, even though again it kind of goes against the initial format of the show. But what I don't personally like about how they handle it on this season is the fact that, again, this ends up being a reward challenge, but with no inherent way of giving immunity in any way, which, as much as I do talk about how needing immunity wins should be a detractor against the assessment of your game, it also is still a natural aspect of the format to give people a way to save themselves outside of the social strategy aspects of the game. And while we do see a later twist kind of do that for the losing tribe. Obviously, I find how that ends up being utilized later to be something that's largely unfair, and I really don't love how the winning tribe doesn't get any opportunity to win immunity, despite being the winning tribe. And obviously, again, they do fix this for down the road, where in future double elimination, challenge ends up essentially becoming an individual immunity challenge instead of a just outright reward challenge, where again, it makes sense to give people on both tribes opportunities to save themselves. But something that they don't end up doing here, which again, I don't love. But again, this ends up being a reward challenge for stew and root beer, which was such a weird combo. But they also get the opportunity to watch the opposing tribe's tribal, which again, last time we saw Jen Kenny be able to go to the women's tribal, but this time it's the entire tribe, which again, I do think is a more fair way of handling this for the entire tribe to get all this information instead of just one individual person. And again, they end up doing this more so in seasons down the road. And while again, another twist I'm not necessarily opposed to, it's something that also just barely ever plays a factor into much, despite obviously being propped up here as this big advantage. But again, the challenge itself ends up being mostly boring, but really cool in concept, and them having to go to this Japanese shipwreck from World War II and then have to dive down to grab sake bottles, which again, really cool playing into the theme of World War II. But again, the challenge doesn't end up being the most riveting TV, though we do see the tribes end up being pretty close until Ibrahim ends up really blowing it for Oolong here, where Kror unsurprisingly pulls out the win once again. But again, despite that, they obviously end up having to go to tribal here for their first and only time before the quote-unquote merge, which I do think is also like a little bit lame here, that they don't end up holding the distinction as a tribe that never goes to tribal because of a twist that forced them to go to tribal in this spot. But again, through their win, that does mean that Kror has to go to tribal first, and we do end up spending a good chunk of the episode on Kror, which is a nice change of pace here, though a lot of their content ends up being pretty superfluous, where we get a lot of talk about the stew and how Ian's excited for the party in his mouth, which again, riveting content. And that's alongside, what do you know, the group just agreeing to vote out Willard. What a shocker, with again Tom being Tom and saying that he can't live with him getting to final two. Oh, we then get some focus around Willard, who, again, to his credit, at least picks up on the fact that he's going home, but also essentially gives up in this spot here. Though we do end up seeing him talk game with Kobe, who continues to get this underdog content, actually wanting Willard to stay, with everyone seeming to be fully aware of this majority alliance, where, again, I do think that shows this majority playing this poorly, and the fact that just everyone knows how blatant the tribe dynamics are at this point. But we do see Kobe wanting to flip the vote onto Katie, as she doesn't do anything, and that he'll puke if she makes it the furthest, which is kind of ironic considering his jury vote, but again, further just shows how little respect Katie had on this season. But it is here where we also end up seeing Greg do some pretty good work that never amounts to anything, but does demonstrate this potential Greg had in the game, and that we do see him talking game with Kobe and really reaching out beyond his alliance, and ends up exposing his alliance to Kobe, and talks about how Tom and Ian are too strong and that he needs to take them out eventually, setting him up to work alongside Kobe and Janu once they get to final 7 to make a move against Tom and Ian, which again would have been this great game move for Greg here, putting him into this power position to go on to win the game, which he just ends up ultimately not doing. The show never really explains why, though again, this could be looked at as Greg just trying to pacify Kobe and making him think that he isn't on the bottom. But in that case, I question why he would leak the majority alliance to him, which obviously would just give Kobe the opportunity to use this information against him. But again, I do think this shows Greg attempting to play a pretty fluid game in this spot, though again, it ultimately doesn't matter by the end of the season. And also, again, there's really just no suspense being built up here for the upcoming Willard vote, where again, even this plan that Greg formates here, again, is under the assumption that Willard and Karen get voted out in the next two tribals, where unsurprisingly we get the tribal where again it's an 8-1 Willard vote, with us getting a decent voting confession from Katie saying you're crabby and you're bitter, which we don't get to see much of on the season, but again, I'll believe it. But in terms of the content that we get from Oolong, really most of it ends just revolving around Ibrahim and how he's the number one target now due to him losing the challenge for the tribe, which I do think is pretty lame here, as again, there isn't any strategy going on, and I think it's actually really dumb for them to vote out Ibrahim for again losing a reward challenge for stew. Again, all the talk about voting out Ibrahim is based around the challenge. Again, I just find that concept very strange, considering there are some serious strategic benefits to voting out Ibrahim in this spot, and the fact that Ibrahim and Bobby John are extremely close. So again, if you allow Ibrahim to stay in the game, he obviously becomes a duo of Bobby John at the time of the Final Four, which obviously gives them half the numbers at that point. To where, again, I do think taking out Ibrahim makes a lot of sense for the games of James, Stephanie, and Angie, but again, we don't get that rationale for why Ibrahim is going home, and instead it's all about the fact that he lost the challenge for them, with James again coming off very negative here, and that he's this big spokesperson for how annoyed he is at Ibrahim, saying his heart wasn't in it. He talks about it as if Ibrahim was quitting the game because he panicked when trying to grab a bottle, I guess. But again, we get the tribal where we do see Karor getting their food in the show, really hamming up Oolong's reactions here, but also here we get some humor from how Oolong ended up bring all their supplies to Tribal, assuming that there was going to be a merge, which ultimately obviously doesn't happen. And again, I don't know why they were expecting a merge, where again, this would have been a pretty early merge for this era of the show, where again, there wouldn't be a final 12 merge for like another 9 seasons at this point. But again, ultimately, it was pretty apparent that Ibrahim was going to get voted out here. That is until a last second twist, feeling very Australian Survivor of them in this spot, revealing that Karor can now decide to give immunity to someone on Oolong. Which, why? Now, as I said previously, I'm happy that there is at least an opportunity for individual immunity in this spot, but I really don't like how they handle it, where, again, being given immunity at the very last second here with no time for the tribe to strategize around this, especially in a spot where Karor can listen into their tribal, gather information, and know who's in danger, and proceed to save the person in danger, where, again, it becomes very apparent that Ibrahim is the person that they would want to save if they were going to do something like that. It ends up being a twist here. Again, while it leads to an interesting result, the way that this twist is handled just makes it come off very unfair and very just contrived. Where again, it's the same issues I have with a lot of these similar twists on Australian Survivor, feeling like it just being added in here because producers know it's gonna cause this crazy drama at the last second. In a spot where, again, I think it would be a lot more interesting if that crazy drama stemmed from actual social strategy. But again, here we end up seeing the Karor members voting for who they want to give safety to, which they strangely don't focus on the show, where we just simply get to the results. And despite the fact that, again, it should have been very apparent that Ibrahim should be the obvious vote to save him from going home, he instead actually only gets 3 votes in a 3-2 to 2-1 vote, with some of the votes here coming off very strange, where again, you would never even know who voted for who if you didn't look this up online. But again, he ends up getting a random combination here of Katie, Jen, and Janu's votes, while Greg ends up being the only vote for Angie, which makes no sense from what we've seen. Tom and Karen end up voting for Bobby John, which seemed to be a respect vote, with Karen calling him a saint, though again, the fact that Tom votes for Bobby John over Steph here does feel a bit weird, and also it's again, why are you giving the strongest member of your opposition immunity in this spot? But also we end up proceeding to see Ian voting for Steph here alongside Kobe, who again doesn't end up backing Angie in this spot, in a spot where he could have, which again, why'd we get that focus on the relationship earlier then? But here again, Ibrahim ends up getting immunity, which does give us our first look at the immunity necklace, which is a pretty cool one here, being made of a shark jaw, which again represents the location here pretty well. But with Ibrahim now being safe, we end up getting again a very hectic vote here, with us getting a 2-2-1 vote, with James and Bobby John voting for Angie, which again isn't too surprising from Bobby John, though a little bit more from James, who seemed to be working the women up to this point, though again, I think you would obviously assume that he would never vote for Bobby John as one, their strongest physical asset, but also something that he seems to have some connection to through, again, their Alabama connection. All while Steph and Angie end up voting for Bobby John here, again, to seemingly separate him and Ibrahim, though in retrospect, they actually could have saved Angie here had they voted for James, as unbeknownst to them, Ibrahim ends up voting for James, which isn't really explained, though obviously very much tell that James could not hide how annoyed he was at Ibrahim, and Ibrahim must have picked up on that. And again, Steph and Angie could have taken that into account and voted for him, but they don't, and instead we get a tie here, where on the revote, both Steph and Ibrahim end up flipping to Angie, where Ibrahim was obviously a given, as obviously he wasn't voting out Bobby John, though a little bit more surprising from Steph, though again, she must have obviously known that was a losing battle, and it is the better play for her to just go along with the majority at this point. And again, we still see Angie leaving on pretty good terms here, telling Steph to rock it for the ladies, with Steph now being the sole woman left on Oolong in a tribe that actually started off with more women than men. And a spot where, again, the only guy to get voted out is one that essentially quit the game, where it's kind of sad that this is the way that Oolong ended up playing out, especially considering, again, like, Angie wasn't meant to go home here. With that, I might as well transition to talk about how Angie was screwed in this position, where I came into this rewatch completely forgetting actually that all this happened. And again, rewatching here, it's just so unlucky the position that Angie was put in here, where largely obviously ends up going home here because Ibrahim was saved at the last second and didn't seem to have a chance to really plan against this. And while, again, I don't know her longevity in the game, even if she survived this round, where she very likely just voted out next time, I do think she stands amongst the most twist-screwed players in Survivor history, considering how all of this has really sprung up on her in the last second. She really had no real way of combating this. Where, again, I think it's a very similar situation to something like a Michelle Yee in Survivor Fiji, of this just being a very difficult position to get out of, especially by the time that the twist ends up actually going through, where, again, I think it would have been a lot more fair here had Karor voted for immunity at the immunity challenge, and they had been able to strategize around that, though obviously, again, they obviously did what they felt like would make for the most chaotic TV here. But with that, let's talk about the boots from this episode, starting it off with Willard, who was kind of there. I mean, he actually did not get that much content on the season, despite the fact that, again, he made 5 episodes in. I mean, he really only got content in first episode, with him being, again, anti-Wanda, and then now in this episode, as he's prepared to go home, to where, again, outside of that, there's not much we really got from him, though, again, it did seem like he was a pretty bad social player, that people did not particularly like him, and with him also being weak in challenges, again, I don't think he had much potential here, but he's someone that at least had some good one-liners here or there. And also, obviously, we got to talk about Angie, who, again, I really liked on this season. Again, on this rewatch here in particular, I very much respected what Angie brought to the show. Her, again, starting off as this pretty big underdog figure and proceeding to be looked at as one of the weakest people in the game, and goes on to actually performing very well in challenges, where, again, her and Steph did extremely well in a lot of the challenges, again, outperforming a lot of the women on Karor. And through that, again, would have been cool to see Angie have a deeper run this season. Would have been cool to see Angie potentially play again. And again, I think she could have had some potential on the return, though obviously, sadly, at this point, it'll never happen, considering obviously Angie sadly passed away in the time since the season. But I do think what she brought us on this specific season, though, was a really fun, like, mini arc here, though one that, I wish we got a bit more of. And now for episode 6, which starts on Oolong, with talk about how crazy the previous tribal was, which is kind of funny considering it's actually kind of tame for modern standards, just with, again, a very contrived twist. But here we do end up seeing James once again being a bit harsh towards Ibrahim, with him scolding him for not being able to dive, which, I mean, he's now said for the billionth time. And again, we get it, but it is here where we see it finally get on Bobby Jobin's nerves, with this setting up James's upcoming boot. Though also here we do get Steph talking about still wanting Ibrahim out, and she isn't changing her mind on that, surely. But this does lead to some nice content for Ibrahim here, who, while he is a largely forgettable Survivor player with a mostly subdued edit here, I do actually appreciate the fact that they did take the time to show Ibrahim praying, with Ibrahim actually being the first ever Muslim player on Survivor, and somehow ending up being the only one until Natalia and Dave vs. Goliath. We're in a time where Islamophobia is running pretty rampant. Again, seeing them highlight this sequence here was something that, again, I did appreciate, especially considering this type of diversity wasn't something super common on the show, and this actually even coming before Kaser on Big Brother 6, who ends up having similar content there. But following that, we do end up cutting to Karor, with Ian still gloating about the stew, because I guess it was that good. But we do end up seeing Karor being a well-oiled machine here, and seeing almost everyone working on the shelter, except for Katie, with us getting talk about how she's the tribe's entertainer, and we see her putting on a sock puppet show, only for the likes of Kobe and Karen to be annoyed at her for not working around camp, which is, again, just another segment here thrown in just to show why Katie isn't respected by her fellow players. But then we get to the reward challenge, where we do strangely see Kobe smiling, seeing that Angie was voted out, which, again, this entire dynamic between Kobe and his relationship with Angie ends up just being so strange in how it's portrayed here. But this also ends up being a pretty bizarre reward in them being taken to Jellyfish Lake to snorkel, which is cool and all, though again, a little bit different for a pre-merge reward. But what makes it even better, and makes it probably the best reward in Survivor history, is that they also get Pringles. exactly what you would want when you're out on Survivor. Either way, the challenge itself ends up being a pretty unique one here, and them having to shoot a machine gun to destroy tiles, which was very strange to see on Survivor, but again, fully fitting into the World War II theme, and shockingly ends up being the last challenge that Oolong ends up winning here, with this being the type of challenge I would have very much expected someone like Tom in particular to do well at, but he ends up actually missing most of his shots, while we surprisingly see Steph do the best at the challenge here, with Jeff coming off very impressed at her, which ultimately gives them the win, to which we obviously get a lot of focus on Oolong on the reward, where here we see that they don't just get regular Pringles, they get Survivor Pringles, with trivia on each of those chips, which was such a weird moment for the show. This is probably the most meta moment in the show up to this point. Again, seeing the Oolong tribe answering trivia about previous Survivor players, again answering like whose Survivor's daughter was named Rhea, and who's won more, men or women, where during that obviously we have James instantly yelling out men, only for him to obviously be wrong, with this being one of the few points in Survivor history where more women have won than men. But again, this is all really surreal to see on the show at this point, and it's funny that it took a Pringles sponsorship to turn them around on wanting to reference previous seasons, though beyond that the rest of the reward ends up being pretty boring, though again they get to swim with jellyfish, so that's something. On Karor, we see him having a terrible night, with it being extremely windy, to where the following morning we end up seeing Janu very much struggling here and very much contemplating quitting, with her seemingly being checked out of the game from this point on, though, I mean, to be honest, was she ever really that checked into the game? But again, this does lead to us getting pretty contrasting content from our two later finalists here, seeing Katie talking about how Janu is losing it and she's always dramatic and just a drama queen, showing her being very dismissive of her here, all while we see Tom consoling her, having this really great line that to me is so see-through, but again, it seemingly works here, and him saying that she's now going to make it to the merge and be on the jury, which, I mean, too far, that part of it's a bit questionable, but then proceeds to say that if we're not all careful, we'll be on the jury voting for you. Again, allowing him to give this somewhat effective pep talk, which, again, if this was me getting this, I would be rolling my eyes the entire time. Though, again, this clearly shows Tom doing the legwork to maintain this relationship with Janu that makes it pretty unsurprising where she ultimately ends up voting by the time of Final Tribal. But then we get to the immunity challenge, another kind of classic challenge where both tribes end up having 20 minutes to build a fortress around their opponent's locker, and once the time is up, they then have to break through what their opposition had made and claim their own locker. A type of challenge that I feel like we see more of on the challenge nowadays, but here we do end up seeing James being extremely confident that he can make it so that they can't even find the knot, which again goes as you would expect, where we once again see Karor pull out the win, with James getting blamed for the loss here, with us getting shots of him just taking his time and like tying his skirt together mid-challenge instead of working on the actual fortress, which is pretty insane. But in the lead up to the vote, we do get the setup of this being a 2v2, with Bobby John and Ibrahim targeting James for his poor challenge performance, all while Steph ends up trying to save James by voting for Ibrahim and even telling him that Bobby John is against him, only for James to not believe it. Again, as usual, being wrong. But this does lead to us getting a pretty important conversation here between Steph and Bobby John that starts with them talking about the previous vote. They talk about how Bobby John got 2 votes, and Steph seemingly ends up tricking him into thinking that it was James that voted for him instead of her, with him even saying that it looked like a guy's handwriting, which again is pretty insane here considering how close Steph was to Angie and how loyal James seemed to be to Bobby John. So again, I guess credit to Steph for that, but I do think her even trying to vote for Bobby John in the previous round felt very misguided to begin with, as I really don't see how she thought she could have actually gotten him out at that point, and again should have tarnished this relationship here. Probably does if it wasn't someone like Bobby John, but instead this ends up leading to them actually making a deal that ends up being pretty important for this end game, where Bobby John ends up telling her that if she ends up voting for James tonight, that he'll end up keeping her over Ibrahim, with Stephanie agreeing to this plan until she doesn't, where it is actually really insane that she does end up proceeding to still vote for Ibrahim coming into Tribal, which again makes no sense for her game, which again just gives incentive for Bobby John to not go through with the deal, as again she didn't necessarily hold up to it. Also, what did she think was going to happen here, where again Ibrahim and Bobby seem to be working in lockstep here at a 4-person vote, to where I think it is genuine insanity that Stephanie ends up playing this the way that she does, where again I think it's either stick with James or flip on the initial vote to take out James. Again, doing the half measure here of not flipping initially but then flipping after the revote is again just really the worst of both worlds. But either way, we get the Tribal, where again we do get some fun Jeff content here, him calling out James for his challenge performance, asking if he's even cut out for the game. But despite that, it's pretty clear that James is going home here, though again Stephanie ends up causing a tie, only for her to flip up afterwards. And we do end up seeing James being pretty shocked at that for whatever reason. Though again, Steph did seem to be genuinely apologetic in this moment to him. But either way, with that, we end up losing James. And as I mentioned before, again, James is an incredible character. He is someone that has some really incredible one-liners across the season. The problem is that, again, some of it has not aged well. Again, there definitely are some borderline misogynistic, definitely homophobic comments that he makes. That, again, just makes some of the things he says just very non-PC in the modern day. But again, I do think James still has these notable moments to me that actually makes him one of the most memorable characters for me from this season. But with that, we then move on to episode 7, where the content for Mulong in this episode ends up being pretty rough with, again, only 3 people remaining and nothing of intrigue really happening outside of the continued talk about how they can't believe they haven't won immunity yet, and us seeing Bobby John hunt for clams, I guess, where this ends up being a very survival-focused episode. Outside of the talk about how Stephanie is hoping that Bobby John sticks to their deal, which again, I wonder if that'll be relevant by the end of the episode. On Koror, we also get a lot of focus on the survival aspects and get what is probably one of the most iconic moments from this season. Certainly one of the most iconic survival-based moments in the history of the show. And it actually starting off with Ian finding a giant clam that must have been an insane catch to get on Survivor and giving them 6 to 7 pounds of meat there. Through that, again, Ian ends up coming off as this great provider, only to then be outclassed by Tom, as this is really just the start of this sequence as we proceed to see them leave the clamshell out on the shore, leading to the return of the shark from 4 episodes ago. Maybe, again, obviously, I don't know if it's the same shark, but could be. Either way, Tom proceeds to kill it single-handedly, with us getting a pretty lengthy section of Tom describing how he did it and him being propped up by his fellow players, with Greg calling him a madman and saying this is one of the most amazing things he's ever seen. While Ian talks about how Tom went up the hell out of him, and Kobe ends up calling him the great shark killer, which, again, is obviously all really great SPV for Tom here, to where I believe this is the point where Tom finally climbed up the Edge community's power rankings, and it's very easy to see why, especially with Tom proceeding to say that the cat's out of the bag and that he's a strong player, because obviously we didn't know that beforehand, and obviously because catching a shark means that you're a good Survivor player, but says that this is going to make it harder for people to vote him out, which again is strong content for him, though I do fundamentally disagree with what he's actually saying in this moment, where again he's talking about this as if it's good for his game, when this is clearly just putting a bigger bullseye on your back, to where, while again, obviously Tom is somebody that would win if he got to the end, he's still portraying himself as such a big threat that no one wants to take him to the end. And beyond that, also, this content doesn't really do much for me personally. Obviously, again, I'm someone that I don't care about the survival aspects of the show. So considering Tom's early edit here is so reliant on that, again, Tom doesn't really click with me as a character at this point. Following this, we do proceed to get back to the Greg and Jen side of the story, with them being talked about as being in the middle, though also impressively from Greg here, we do see him being very aware of his position in the game and how he's being perceived, and being wary of the fact that people could be catching on to them being in that position. And through that, we do see him trying to separate himself a bit from Jen, to which that ends up annoying Jen for being standoffish with her. Again, not seeming to be very game-minded in this instance, where, again, I did come into this rewatch very much remembering Jen as this, like, very underrated player, though I will say it's moments like this that do make me question that notion, with her being annoyed at how Greg is all focused on the game, which is like, again, you should be too. But this does end up leading to some more strong content from Tom, as we see him being very wary of them and how tight they are, which again, considering the fact that we saw Greg previously plotting against Tom, again, this does show Tom in a very positive light, even though he doesn't end up doing a single thing about it. But either way, also in this episode, we do get a reward challenge with the return of the SOS signal challenge, of them having to make an SOS signal. Again, a classic challenge from the first few seasons that actually hasn't been back since Marquesas, and sadly, this ends up being the last time we do see it on the show, where again, I do think this is typically a pretty fun challenge that creates the opportunity for character moments, but here on Mulong, we do see them instantly creating a plan to burn down their old shelter and bathroom, which again, pretty insane that in production ends up handing them the materials for a bathroom, and instead they end up burning it here. But on Koror, we end up seeing only 3 people being allowed to participate, which really does start to highlight just how much of an advantage Koror has at this point in the game, where again, we do see Oolong talking about needing to win, as if they don't win, they won't have any food, as again, they won't have the time to catch any food or have any other members to catch food while they're doing this. All while on Koror, again, they have 5 other members being able to do whatever they want, as long as it's not helping out on the SOS challenge, meaning that, again, they can hunt for food, they can help out at camp, while also allowing those 5 to conserve energy for the upcoming immunity challenge, while also at this point Koror just just being able to handpick who's the best for each individual challenge. And through that, again, it just gives Karor just such a massive lead at this point that, again, it just feels completely insurmountable. But as for the results, we do end up seeing Karor struggling to get fire in time, with the other tribe members being annoyed at them for their performance, though they end up having a signal that ends up being bigger and more visible than Oolong's, where Oolong ends up making the mistake of having their signal further away from the beach, and through that harder to see, to where despite the fact that we get Bobby John jumping up and down like a madman and proceeding to jump into the ocean when the plane goes over them for some reason, which again was really funny. And they end up ultimately losing to Karor once again here, who ends up proceeding to get military food packages, fully fitting into the World War II theme, to which we get content about how Oolong is now exhausted and clearly in the dumps, leading into the immunity challenge. And who would have guessed it? It's another disaster for Oolong, where this challenge essentially just ends up being a slide puzzle they have to do in the water, one that is, again, relatively quick. And here we end up seeing Oolong just seemingly not know how to do a slide puzzle, and again, switching out colors, and by the time they do all that, Karor just ends up easily winning here. And with that, obviously the vote ends up coming down to Bobby John deciding between his closest friend in Ibrahim or Stephanie, who he obviously made a deal with, which I'll say with that, it's pretty shocking that him and Ibrahim never actually made a deal or an alliance of any sort, though also, again, not really that shocking based on this being Bobby John, who, again, might not be the most strategic player in the world, but again, we do end up getting a lot of focus on Stephanie getting paranoid that Bobby John is going to pick her, where, to be fair, Bobby John does end up acting pretty sketchy around her, saying that he doesn't want to talk about the vote, even though he does end up saying in confessional that he is siding with Steph in this spot. But again, this ends up being some pretty poor play from Bobby John, in that he does end up turning Steph away, allowing her to go to Ibrahim and leaking to him that Bobby John promised her safety, which I think is also equally sloppy play from Steph, as obviously now this just gives ammunition for Ibrahim to use this against Stephanie, though again, that doesn't end up mattering. And realistically, at the end of the day, I think this is a very marginal choice for Bobby John, where, again, there's pros and cons either way. Obviously, Steph is better at challenges and can help him at the next challenge, but also stuff for competition for down the road, and someone that is probably more respected in the game than someone like Ibrahim, though also is better connected on the opposite side, which also in itself can be a pro and a con. Again, a pro in the sense that it can open up roads where they end up using Steph and Bobby John as numbers, though also the downsides is the fact that obviously Bobby John would be voted out over Steph. So again, I think there's a lot of pros and cons on the Stephanie side of things, while on the Ibrahim side of things, he is simply just a number, and a pretty loyal one. So I think there would be an argument for keeping Ibrahim around, though realistically, none of this matters anyway, as essentially Bobby John's pretty screwed at this point, and really just anyone on Oolong is pretty screwed at this point, as no one's going to allow them to get to the end. But either way, we get the tribal, where really the only notable thing about this tribal is the fact that Jeff Probst lost his voice, which I found pretty funny here. Again, I had no memory of this, and again, just seeing Jeff struggling to speak at points was kind of humorous, but again, a largely forgettable tribal, and obviously Ibrahim ends up being voted out by the end, where, again, Ibrahim's someone that I do like on the show. Again, not that he brought any true entertainment to the show at any real point, but again, I do think having a Muslim player being able to talk about their faith on the show is, again, cool to see for this time period, where, again, I obviously always remember Kaser, the gangsta style content that Ibrahim got back on Big Brother 6, though, again, this was actually, again, right before that, to where, and the fact that Survivor did that as well, again, I think is pretty cool to see. So again, it just sucks that Ibrahim's just not a particularly interesting character in his own right. He doesn't really do much on this season. He is someone that is, again, largely affable, but again, doesn't really bring much entertainment and didn't seem to be playing the game particularly hard either. But now we're at episode 8. Obviously a very iconic episode, with this obviously concluding the Oolong storyline. But we start off the episode with Stephanie revealing to Bobby John that she was so nervous and thought that she was going, which, why are you telling him that? That's just telling him that you don't trust him. Now again, obviously it doesn't really matter, and it's not like he can vote her out in this specific situation, and beyond this, again, he needs her, but still, again, suboptimal play. But obviously then we get them talking about how they need to bring home the victory, and that they're the best ones for the job, taking us to the reward challenge, the gross food eating competition, which was obviously a staple at this point in the show, and here we do have them eating balut, an egg with a partially formed duckling, probably the second most iconic food used in these style of challenges outside of grubs, and personally probably the thing that I for sure would not be able to stomach eating here. But again, the challenge itself ends up being handled in a strange way, as again, we only have 2 people on Oolong, and with that means that only 2 people have to eat for each individual tribe, meaning that we have the same 4 people eating balut over and over and over again. And initially, all that matters is finishing your plate, which again, I never loved that aspect of these style challenges, where he did this a lot back in the day. And again, it's not shocking that we end up up in a tiebreaker where that ends up in a race between Tom and Bobby John, which ends up being a pretty humorous scene for Bobby John here. Again, him just shoving them into his mouth and trying to use his fish to push him down his throat, only for him to end up choking on them anyway, and Tom to obviously easily win here. And with that, we get like Bobby John just standing there shocked with his mouth open with food still in it, which again is a really funny visual. But through that, Crore ends up winning a 55-gallon tank of water to make camp life even easier for them, as now they have water that they can use to drink, but also to clean with, as they also get cleaning supplies, with this clearly being a sponsor segment as we continuously get shots of the logos of the products. But this does end up actually becoming a pretty big source of conflict here. We do see Tom showing his domineering ways once again, where here we see some of the tribe members wanting to take showers with the water and clean themselves off, only for Tom to put his foot down. It says it's ridiculous that they would want to do that, and demands that they only use it for drinking water, which again, why is Tom doing this? I mean, even if he does genuinely believe this is the better call from a survival standpoint, again, this is just further pissing off people and making them less likely to want to go to the end with you and less likely to want you around. Where again, I just feel like this is completely unnecessary here, and again goes against his initial mantra that he had coming into this season. But beyond that, we do get some content about the rats on Crore, leading to Kobe's typical session of ranting about his tribe, particularly Tom, being annoyed at Tom leaving the shark head of the shark that he killed previously out in the open, which ends up attracting bugs. Again, showcasing Tom's ego here, all while we then also have him complaining about Katie as usual, but also Janu, talking about how they equally don't do anything and wants to push him into the fire, which is obviously a pretty harsh thing to say, especially when, again, in relation to Janu, who's his number one ally. But also here we do get some positive content around Tom, with him and Ian strategizing for the future, again showing them being concerned about Greg and Jen, but also talking about wanting Stephanie to make it to the merge, reestablishing the Tom, Ian, Katie, Steph alliance on the show, again indicating that will be important for down the road, and kind of made it obvious that Steph was going to survive this episode, as why else would this be here? But again, this does end up showing Tom thinking forward, recognizing his spot in his current alliance, and thinking that might not be the most optimal for his endgame, and wanting Steph as a number, which would be cool if he actually did any of that. And then we cut to Oolong for more positive content revolving around Tom, through some good SPV from Bobby John, talking about Tom as the only person that could beat him in these challenges. But it does end up leading to more negative content for Bobby John from Stephanie, with her saying that Bobby John's getting frustrated about his losing, and we then see him like throwing and punching things, with her saying that it scares her, and she proceeds to talk about how she doesn't even know what to say to him, and they have nothing in common, which is actually a pretty funny thing about this season, and the fact that coming out of this season, Bobby John and Steph are talked about as this duo, when the reality is that they actually were not particularly close in or out of the show. Again, on the actual season, like we never actually see them truly working together until the last second here, and that's just seemingly because they're basing it around who's the two strongest competitors on the tribe, more so than any personal connection that they actually had. But again, this scene really emphasizing that, and having like Steph call him a caveman, and saying that he's just so dirty and eats everything, including the shell of a crab somehow. But also he does like snot rockets around camp. Again, making it seem like he's just this terrible person to live with here. And also, again, in a position where we never actually see Bobby John's point of view in all this. This is purely coming from Stephanie, making it clear that she was our protagonist for this episode, and that we're clearly meant to be rooting for her over Bobby John. Especially considering she then also gets a pretty sympathetic segment as well, talking about how hard it's been losing, but also being without family. And she gets through this, she can get through anything, and talk about how she's never giving up, which is again just this ultimate underdog content for her. But eventually we get to the immunity challenge, with again only two people competing for each tribe, where it ends up being Bobby John and Stephanie versus Greg and Kobe, and a pretty typical challenge of like going through a course to get puzzle pieces and solving a word scramble, where what do you know, Crore easily wins here, meaning that Crore has successfully won every pre-merge immunity challenge and has completely decimated the Oolong tribe in what is now called Oolonging, similar to the coinage of the Pagonging, with again the decimation of Pagong in Borneo, and that's used to imply an entire tribe getting taken out all in a row, getting taken out during the post-merge phase, while an Oolonging is a similar thing but for the pre-merge phase, more so in a spot where a tribe just loses challenges constantly, and through that loses most of its members come into the merge, where obviously that ends up being the lasting impact of Oolong, that being a tribe taken down to just one member. Even though I'll say the way that it actually does end up happening here here does feel a little bit contrived. Where I know there are rumors out there that this is a season that was meant to merge earlier, but they end up prolonging the pre-merge phase to allow this oolong storyline to play out. And while I don't know if that exactly is what happened here, and I think there is evidence to say, particularly around like what the challenges are and how they're structured, that again, I don't think that's necessarily the case. I would say they probably were intended to merge at Final 9 the entire time, even though again, it does feel weird for them to do that considering it's a 20-person season. But again, it doesn't feel like the situation that happened in Survivor Thailand, where I feel like that's one where I think very clearly they did prolong the pre-merge. As you could tell, the challenges they used right before the merge were ones that could be played individually. But again, that isn't really the case here. And like truly thinking about it, again, like while this is a 20-person cast, due to the actual formatting of it, again, it's more so an 18-person cast with a merge at 9, which again is exactly what they did in Survivor All-Stars. So again, it's not actually that insane that they would do this, though I think the thing you would argue is obviously that All-Stars is a season that had a swap and an absorption along the way. And through that, I think that is the main thing that I take away from this season, is the fact that, again, I don't know if they necessarily merged late on this season based on what they were originally planning. However, I do very much feel like they probably just didn't swap in a spot where they meant to. Where, again, I think it's pretty insane to think that they generally constructed this season to have 8 rounds on the same tribe formations to where, and I do think, again, the canceling of a swap is something that is, again, very easy to do, where obviously either way you would still have these 2 tribe challenges, and these challenges would still be made with it in mind that there could be a variant amount of players remaining in the game by that point, to where, again, I do think that is probably what happened here. Again, they canceled the swap to allow this oolong situation to happen, as again, it is an interesting storyline, as either way, you're going to get either the complete decimation of a tribe, or a situation where a tribe almost gets demolished, but then it has this really incredible underdog win by the end. Again, I think either way, it could play out pretty well from their point of view, but again, from my point of view, I don't personally think this is good TV, where to me it's just kind of lame just to see the same tribe go to tribal over and over again, and straight up, this is a situation that I just never would ever want to see again. Though to be fair, I think it's very rare for a season to play out in this way. Where while this was obviously a very extreme situation, one that I think was going to be rare no matter what, of a tribe losing every single immunity challenge, I also do feel like it's a spot where the way that modern seasons are structured are not really in a way that I would expect this to happen. Now again, it theoretically can, where again, we've had close calls along the way with the likes of Ua and Matt Singh. Ua being one that again literally could have happened had they just lost one more immunity challenge. Though again, I think practically I don't expect production to want an oolonging to happen. I mean, we saw like with Matt Singh, obviously they did an absorption along the way, and again, I think that is probably what they would do in most case situations where something like this is about to occur. That I do think they probably would try to avoid situations like this, as again, I don't think it leads to a particularly interesting episode by the end, where obviously through this, that means that there's no vote off, there's no strategizing that can happen. It's just going to be fire making with, again, no real suspense in what's going to happen because there's no decisions to be made. It's literally just them being instantly thrown in to fire because they just lost the immunity challenge at that point. Though again, I think on this season in particular, I think it's very clear production did want this to happen. Where again, this is just a very unique storyline. And again, one I would not be shocked that they put their hands on the scales a little bit to try to make something like this happen, especially during these last couple rounds. And again, to be for this specific season, it's obviously a very unique aspect of this season, something that very much stands out as part of this season's identity. And I think probably plays a factor into its popularity, where again, I think this storyline makes this season just instantly recognizable as a season with the oolonging, and obviously really propelled Steph into popularity. Again, nearly unmatched popularity in Survivor history, all mixing that in with the popularity of Tom as well as this very physical dominant winner. It really led to this being looked at as this like massive rebound season for Survivor after the lack of popularity we got with Survivor Vanuatu. So again, this was a very well received season by fans at the time, and I know production liked this season as well, and it's probably proved to them that this is a show that can continue running. As again, I think Vanuatu is probably a scary point for production, them feeling like the show had kind of lost steam after All Stars. Yeah, I feel like Palau is a season where I do think they looked at it as a pretty big success by the end, but again, because there's only 2 people on Oolong, and obviously their votes would end up nullifying each other, we instead learned that they're going to be instantly thrown into a tiebreaker here, and that being an individual immunity challenge to determine who goes home, where I really don't like this conceptually, where obviously, yes, this is at the end of the day just a tiebreaker. I don't like that we got to the point where the players, again, just don't have any decisions to make here. No opportunity to save themselves through social strategy means, with the entire round of gameplay coming down to just challenges. Again, no decisions for the players to make. But again, despite that, we still get a decent amount of content from Oolong following this. Despite the fact that, again, there's no game to be played. And it's really just content about them talking about like why they need to win. And we hear about Bobby John being good at fire making, which I wonder if that's going to be relevant. But also along the way, we actually do get a scene from Koror. Again, a rarity to see content from a tribe isn't going to tribal after the immunity challenge. But again, this ends up being used to fully wrap up Koror's storyline as these initial underdogs and now having won every immunity challenge, which again, I do think is a very impressive feat here for this tribe. Again, a tribe that had a fair share of this function within it, and somehow they were able to still stick together and actually make it to the merge together, and we do see in many other seasons that this dominant tribe would end up trying to throw a challenge along the way. But again, Koror here ends up somehow being able to resist all that. But again, this scene ends up also providing some pretty strong content for Kobe, or essentially the last time, and how he talks about how he's made fun of at school and looked at as this girly guy, and that caused him to quit school, and talks about how he isn't going to let that happen to him again. Again, all of which being very strong personal content for Kobe here, but also essentially the last strong content we get from Kobe, where I feel like his edit just takes a complete nosedive in the following episode. But then we do get the tribal with the reveal that the challenge being used here is the key to survival, that being the ability to make fire, with us seeing Bobby John smirking at this reveal and Steph saying that she isn't that good to really hype up Steph as, again, more of an underdog. But again, with that, we should talk about the concept of fire making in this spot, as again, this is the first time in Survivor history we see this being used as a tiebreaker on the show, something that obviously is now just baked into the format of the show at Final Four, but again, all stemming from the use of the challenge here. And conceptually, I do really like the inclusion of fire making as a tiebreaker mechanic in a spot where rocks cannot function properly. And again, I like it because it's very thematically satisfying, as again, fire represents life, while it is also mostly fair. Now, I think that is more so the case nowadays, and withstanding terrible wind, but again, now that everyone knows that's a part of the format and knows that they should be practicing for it, again, I do think it's become a more fair aspect of the show now. But for this specific time period in the show, I think this actually does end up, again, kind of catering towards the men, where again, just due to societal norms, there is a bias being put on the fact that we see men typically being the ones who start the fire. And so again, I think like when they don't know that this fire making challenge is going to happen, I don't like how this, again, it kind of inherently favors men who are more likely to be in the fire maker position, though thankfully it doesn't really work out in that way in this specific spot. But I will say, like, despite the fact that this is obviously a very iconic moment for the show, I do find the presentation of this fire making challenge here to be very lacking, where it just goes by pretty quickly and it just feels like an afterthought in the episode, despite the fact that it plays out in a pretty interesting way, where again, supposedly it was very close between the two, to the point where they had to be shown footage afterwards. They had Stephanie supposedly winning by like a millisecond, though again, you wouldn't really know that by watching the show. And again, I know there are rumors around the fire making challenge that was a bit wonky, as they wanted Steph to win here, which again, it does seem like that is likely not true at this point. But again, I know the big rumor was that supposedly that there was a redo and that Bobby John had initially won the first run of it, only for supposedly Steph's materials to be deemed faulty, and during the redo, Stephanie ended up winning like we saw, which again, I believe has been more recently debunked, with Bobby John relaying that close finish story as the wonky thing that happened at the challenge in a more recent interview. But again, this is all still a pretty massive moment for the show, again, having Steph as this last person standing from Oolong, again, this massive underdog, not just in the game as a whole, but also just in this specific moment. And again, her beating Man, that was debatably, again, the hardest working Survivor player ever in a fire making challenge. Again, a very impressive result here, and one further solidifies Steph's popularity. Again, not just being popular with the casual fans of the show, but also looked at as this like massive role model for young girls, where again, you hear a lot about people talking about being inspired by Stephanie to want to play Survivor, and mention her as a player that they're the most like, which, I mean, again, those players clearly have not watched Survivor Guatemala, but again, Stephanie was massively popular at the time, again, essentially being the next big star for the show after Rupert Mania, to where, again, I know that actually caused some resentment between her and Rupert, which again, maybe I'll talk about when we get the heroes versus villains. But again, this ends up also being a pretty sorrow exit for Bobby John, with like Jeff even saying, the tribe definitely didn't speak tonight, but it's still your time to go, all while proceeding to prop up Steph and set up her having to live on her own, which I will say, I'm pretty shocked that they actually did that they made Steph spend the night alone on Oolong, where obviously it ends up being a pretty iconic moment for the show, and again, really increases her likability. Though I did find it to be just a bit of a strange strange decision, considering they literally end up sending it to Crore to Falling Day anyway. But anyway, with that, we end up losing Bobby John. And Bobby John's a character I've always personally liked. Again, while he's obviously not a particularly good player, one that, again, doesn't really have a grasp for a strategic game, and one that I think really made it through all the rounds that he did on Oolong, simply because he was deemed the best competitor on the tribe. I still feel like Bobby John is someone that does actually provide for some pretty good character moments. And again, it's this very funny dichotomy of Bobby John, the fact that most of the time he's just a super chill guy, seemingly as nice as he could be, but then all of a sudden he could just instantly turn on a dime. Again, these moments where like he's again just shoving this food in his face, these moments where he freaks out when a bag hits him during that first reward challenge. It just feels like he goes from 0 to 100 in an instant, and that is something I've always loved from Bobby John. Mind you, I think we probably get some better character stuff when we see him a bit down the road, but I think on this specific season, I think Bobby John ended up being a very interesting character, though one that, again, didn't really have the most savvy strategic mind for the game. But with that, we then get to episode 9, the kind of merge episode, where we start off the episode with Steph on her own at Oolong, with, again, this being a very iconic segment that has her staying up all night to tend to the fire, saying that she's never giving up and she isn't a quitter, which, I mean, we'll talk about it. But again, we end up seeing her fishing the following morning, only to not catch anything, and then we see her struggling to get a coconut from the top of a tree, and eventually gets one, where again, it does show her persevering here, but again, kind of weird to see her being propped up as this like ultimate survivor postseason, when again, she actually kind of sucked at the survival aspects of the game, but ultimately she ends up getting tree mail saying, "Do not open and give to Crore tribe," with her now being tasked with rowing out on a canoe to Crore's camp. It's where, again, I wonder what that means, and this all ends up being a pretty endearing moment here of Steph just kind of breaking down at the moment that she reads this, struggling to even finish the note, being happy to have friends and food, with obviously this all leading up to her being absorbed into Crore, meaning that this is a season that doesn't have a formal merge, where while this is for all intents and purposes, again, a merge, where it serves the same purpose, it is, again, technically an absorption, and the tribe does still remain Crore, which I actually do think is thematically satisfying. Now, again, I don't think it was purposeful, because we do know that there was a planned green buff to be used as the merge tribe, but again, I do think the idea of Crore having defeated its enemy in war and took it over, again, I think is something that actually kind of fits with the overall themes of the season. But before Steph ends up arriving, we actually do get some content on Crore, with, again, some negative content here around Kobe and Janu. So again, I wonder who's going to be the first two out of Crore. But again, we do have Ian talking about how they're pains in the ass, with Janu just laying in a hammock all day and clearly being checked out of the game, while Kobe ends up just being kind of grumpy and sick of his tribe, seemingly spending hours away from the others, with him saying that he just wants to stay away from the boys, where again, I do think actually the lack of losing here ends up actually playing a pretty big impact onto Kobe himself, who, again, seemed to be this perfectly sociable guy early on in the game, though, and just seemed to have some people that really got on his nerves. And with obviously his inability to get rid of some of those people along the way, it seems like he gets to the point where he just kind of sabotages his own game in this spot, just because he's clearly annoyed at his fellow players, which ends up making him not really live up to the potential that it felt like he seemed to have at the very beginning of the season. But eventually Steph ends up arriving on Crore, with her getting a pretty warm reception, with him just being excited to see somebody new here, that is, except for Janu, who doesn't even bother getting up, which is kind of funny. But again, here we end up seeing Steph talking about this being a new chapter in her life, and that she's ready to start winning, which she'll certainly do. Though we do see this immediately countered by Jen, who talks about being worried about her weaseling her way in and saying that she needs to go fast, which again made it very clear that this probably wasn't going to work out for Stephanie. But here we do also get the reveal that they'll be getting visitors arriving soon, where in place of a traditional feast at the merge, for some reason we end up getting a visit from locals that, to be fair, I mean, helped them catch a lot of fish that they end up feasting on, but again ends up leading to a weird amount of focus on the survival aspects of the show during this merge episode, and where, again, typically merge episodes are very much used to set up new dynamics from the groups coming together, though obviously that is a major reason why I feel like this episode feels very different, where obviously the only thing new about this merge episode is the addition of Stephanie. So instead of spending this time on setting up these new relationships, we instead just focus on the guys going out fishing. Though, to be fair, this actually did lead to some drama, where obviously only the guys are allowed to fish here, but here we do end up seeing the local saying to leave two guys behind to catch bait, to which Kobe ends up volunteering here and wanting to do so alongside Ian, only for Tom to ask the locals if he can bring 3 people with them, as Ian should also learn how to fish, which obviously ends up upsetting Kobe here, with Tom essentially excluding Kobe from learning how to fish here. And to be fair, I actually don't think Tom was necessarily doing this deliberately to leave Kobe out of it and making Kobe feel bad. I feel like it was more so just, again, he genuinely just wanted Ian to learn. But again, I think it's another moment of, again, Tom just being so domineering and making these decisions that, again, are potentially the best for surviving, but again, are not really the best calls from a more social standpoint. And again, we end up seeing Kobe not really acting to this well, which, again, further sinks his game, but does lead to, again, some fun Kobe content, confessional, being annoyed at Tom for also trying to learn how to catch bait. We see Kobe saying, "I'm bait man, you're fish man, I could do it myself," which I always found to be kind of a funny line. But again, we do end up seeing them catching a lot of fish here, all while also being given rum, with Tom proceeding to get extremely drunk here, really stammering over his words and again falling in the shelter, with Katie calling him a lightweight, which was kind of fun content there. All while the remainder of the camp life here does really revolve around Kobe, first in his continued annoyance of Tom mocking his fake laugh and going on his typical tirade about how no one's playing the game, which really just means that no one's playing the game that he wants them to play. But through that, again, we end up seeing him making the decision to try to pull in Steph. Again, very blatantly doing so in front of everybody to where everyone knew what he was doing. And through that, they're able to essentially just end up undoing all the work that he attempts to do here. To where, again, I do think the approach that he has here is pretty bad and just how blatant he is doing this. But also here, we end up seeing him just essentially just dump everything to Steph here. Again, telling her about everything that happened on Karor, telling her about the 5-person majority alliance and that he's on the outs with Janu and Karen, talks about how Greg and Jen were willing to flip on Tom and Ian, which I think that line in particular is the one that I take the most umbrage with, in the fact that, as we do end up seeing, again, Steph does still want to work with Tom and Ian based on their previous connection, and now with this knowledge that Greg and Jen were willing to flip, it just gives Steph ammunition to, one, better her position with Tom and Ian, but also use this information to turn Greg and Jen against Kobe. This spot where, again, it did seem like Greg and Jen, at least at one point, were considering flipping over to Kobe's side to take out Tom and Ian. But through this, again, it makes it very clear they just can't trust them anymore, especially with him also leaking about how Jen is jealous of Steph about beating her in challenges. To where, again, I would not be shocked that end up turning them very anti-Kobe, though to be fair, again, we don't really get much of Jen and Greg's reaction to this. To where, again, for all we know, and again, I probably assume this is the case, the fact that I assume they probably were already voting out Kobe by this point. I think they probably already had enough of Kobe and felt like they had other options for making this move against Tom and Ian for down the road. But I do think Greg and Jen voting out Kobe here is something that I do think ends up being a pretty bad move. I think it's one where, again, I think I would have taken the shot. I think I would have used Kobe as this number to make the move here. Again, where again, I think you kind of have to take the shot at Tom and Ian whenever you can, especially considering how good they are at challenges. Though, again, I fully get why they would be sketched out to be working with Kobe after they know that he threw him under the bus. But, and really just in general, again, I do think this pitch from Kobe here really ends up being a net negative for him by the end. Again, while I think he was probably screwed either way, I think this, again, doesn't help the fact that we, again, proceed to immediately see Stephanie rat this out to the likes of, again, Katie and Janu and Tom, to where, again, it seems to end up really securing the fact that Stephanie is safe for this round. Again, I guess credit to her for that, even though really I think this is more so just, again, kind of Kobe digging his own grave. And something I do think kind of makes it even funnier is the fact that it does seem like Kobe is actually kind of unaware of the fact that he is the immediate target, where obviously Kobe knows that he's on the bottom, and I think he assumed that he was probably a goner within the next 2 rounds, but it does seem like in this specific spot that he actually thought that he was safe, that he did think that Janu was potentially going home, where it very much felt like this campaign to Steph here was actually not a move to make the move against Tom and Ian right now, but more so a move to pick up Stephanie as an ally for the following round after he had voted out Janu, who's his other ally, which again, I think that is also kind of a questionable play here, as again, I think Janu is someone that he very much needed for his game, and again, maybe he thought at that point he can get Greg and Jen to flip, but again, I do think his overall approach here is one that I do think is largely misguided, but I do think it's one that, again, very much helps obviously the Tom and Ians of the world, again, keeping Steph around, someone that is a potential option for them, while getting rid of Kobe, who is in their biggest opposition, both from a physical standpoint, but also from the fact that, again, he just simply doesn't like them, where again, through that makes Kobe the pretty obvious boot in this spot. But with that ends up taking us to the immunity challenge, where I did find it funny to see some of these Karor members finally having to participate in a challenge after they haven't been in the last few episodes. But here they're thrust into the return of a pretty iconic immunity challenge, that being the perch, with this actually being the last time that we see it in its initial form on Survivor US. A challenge where you just obviously stand on a perch, again, kind of the most baseline endurance comp that could exist, but one that does typically provide for some fun moments, as we typically see Jeff, coming out with temptations, but also one that they clearly stopped because of how long it typically goes for. But again, it ends up being a fun challenge here where we do get some drama here from Jeff asking Tom about Stephanie potentially being a free vote, leading to Kobe once again just outing the majority alliance mid-challenge, and also proceeding to take the first temptation, that being a plate of donuts, with him then again kind of just trolling the others and again licking it, which again, it was just very funny content here, even though again, terrible gameplay, and again, it just felt like he was just kind of over it. But beyond that, we also get another meta moment here of Ian referencing to the stripping for chocolate and peanut butter from the Amazon, Jeff saying that no one wants to see that, but again, kind of surprising this made the edit. But then we ended up proceeding to see everybody but Tom, Karen, and Stephanie drop out for some cookies, with Tom being pretty resolute here in the fact that he won't step down and he could stay all night because he's a stubborn Irishman, I guess, which, I mean, to be fair, we do end up seeing that being true for down the road, but the challenge ends up culminating here with Karen and Stephanie dropping out for pizza. Again, Stephanie dropping out for pizza. A person who literally earlier in the episode talked about she's never giving up, which, I mean, obviously, to be fair, she probably was pretty confident in the fact that Kobe was going home over her. But again, content that felt very opposed to really most of the content she's been getting for these last couple episodes. But again, Tom wins immunity here, his first of too many wins on this season. But it's also here where we get the reveal that we're going straight to tribal, which is a weird aspect of this round that wasn't mentioned beforehand, and I assume it had to do with the fact that it was already nighttime and that kind of forced their hand to doing immediate tribal. But I do wonder if this was always purposeful, as again, they had to have known that this challenge was going to go pretty late to where, and I doubt that they didn't intend on this from the very beginning. But again, it's something I really don't love. I don't love the fact that, again, we're not giving players the time to strategize coming into tribal. And while at the end of the day, I don't think it really changed much for this round, I think it was very clearly going to be a Kobe boot no matter what. I still don't feel like it's a particularly fair way of handling things here. But again, we do get the tribal where we do already get signs of Janu's desire to quit, saying that she thinks it's her tonight and it doesn't worry her, which is kind of funny, as that actually made it more likely they were going to keep her around, as again, she more than likely would have been booted in the pre-merge had they ever lost a challenge, but now in the post-merge, because then she's a player that just simply isn't doing anything, they're obviously going to keep her around. It's just, again, she's not a threat to anybody. But ultimately, we do end up getting a pretty obvious Kobe vote here, with Ian getting a pretty fun confessional comparing this to the Mafia and saying it's your time to get whacked, all while we do end up seeing Kobe voting for Janu and Janu voting for Steph, with the remaining 7 votes landing on Kobe. And Kobe's a player that I really loved on my rewatch, where Kobe is someone that I really did not remember particularly fondly coming into this rewatch. Like, while I thought he had like a couple fun moments here and there, I forgot just how major of a narrator he is on Karor through the early episodes of this season. And through, again, I end up really liking Kobe here. Again, gameplay wise, definitely have some gripes. I don't think he played particularly well, but I think it is a kind of a travesty that we never got to see Kobe play again, where obviously I know he was in the running for Micronesia, but again, I think Kobe was someone that was such a great narrator, someone that had some very biting confessionals, and someone that I think could provide a decent amount of drama on the return, while also being, again, a very strategic player, at least when he's not grumpy, to where, again, I think Kobe had a lot of potential here, especially to be a really fun character for the show, and I'm kind of sad we never got to see it again beyond this. But now for episode 10, a somewhat controversial episode, largely revolving around Janu, where really this entire episode kind of revolves around Janu, and that we first end up getting her shocked reaction to Kobe being voted out, as, again, she wanted it to be her, but again, this does lead to some drama with Katie doing what she does and complaining about Janu here, saying that she's a crazy person, that she's a jack-in-a-box with a creepy face, which is a ridiculous description that Janu ends up hearing, leading to some bickering between the two, with Katie saying that you were being creepy, and Janu being upset that she didn't just say it to her face, and yet Katie saying I'm sorry, and Janu saying you don't have to be sorry. And again, it's a fun little back and forth, with it also being interlaced with some fun Katie confessionals. And while it does seem like most of the tribe is just kind of over Janu by this point, we do see Greg again highlighting how there's no point in voting her out, as she plays a bigger role in his strategy, and Steph threatens that, and that winning the game isn't about deserving, and if you have a role in my strategy, you deserve to be here, which I do think is kind of ironic considering his jury speech. But I do actually think this really hits the nail on the head of how the term deserving in Survivor is just very arbitrary. It doesn't really mean anything. Again, no one really deserves anything in the game, and does show Greg having this like really good understanding of the game, which I don't think you would necessarily expect coming into this season. And with that, I guess I should talk about Greg's role in this round. And that, again, this makes it very clear that Greg was someone actively trying to keep Janu in the game as a number in an attempt to use it against Tom and Ian for down the road. Again, being a major reason why he ends up leading the charge and getting Steph out, as again, he thinks Steph is more with Tom and Ian. To where, again, I do think Greg at this point clearly had a game plan on how to take out Tom and Ian and get to the end against people he thought he could more easily beat, which again, I do think would have been the case had he been able to pull off this move. I think he would have been the front runner at that point, though obviously Janu ends up quitting, which you can say is him being screwed over by that, but the reality is, I don't know if he would have been able to actually execute on this move anyway. Where again, going back to the Kobe vote, I do think Kobe was a much better person to keep around for Greg in particular than Janu in this spot, to where while Janu is somebody that Greg seemed to think was in his pocket, I don't think he had that much influence with Janu, and I personally would never have real faith in Janu actually making a move against Tom, and eventually the same thing would go for Karen as well, to where, and I don't know how he was planning on actually making this move, as I don't feel like he really did effective enough legwork to actually make this very realistic, where actually I think the more realistic play is actually what he later attempts to do, of just going down to the 5 and hoping that everyone just looks at Tom as such a big threat to take him out there. Where I think considering his current positioning at this point, I think it would have been very difficult to pull off the move without the approval of the likes of Katie and Ian. But again, this ends up leading us into the reward challenge, playing out similarly to what happened at the final 8 of Vanuatu, of doing the now standard post-merge team challenge, which again, has become the norm in Modern Survivor, and I still find these really boring, and I don't like how they go against the concept of challenges meant to be done individually in the post-merge. And again, ends up being a pretty lacking challenge, again, involving water and climbing and getting a flag. It's like, who cares? But the team of Greg, Tom, Janu, and Karen ends up winning a reward here and get a Palauan feast, which actually ends up being a little humorous, as again, it's another scene that ends up revolving around Janu here, of her getting sick from the food, and we see her puking as the others are trying to eat. But again, we do also see them being able to smuggle some food back to camp, a unreasonably large amount of food, because obviously Kror needed even more food than they already have. But again, this ends up leading to drama once again, with Janu trying to eat some of the food that they brought back, where obviously I get that she didn't eat any of the food while on the reward itself, and also the fact that she doesn't care about the game at this point, but obviously a very bad look for her, even though again, doesn't really matter anyway. But anyway, we get to the immunity challenge, where we do learn that it's a test of your ability to not panic, this being the first appearance of Last Gasp, another really iconic challenge to stem from this season, one that they actually did bring back again somewhat recently for Survivors 43 and 44, but has actually probably become more of a staple in international versions of the show, and just in general, a really notable challenge here of you having to hold your breath under a grate while the tide rises, and the person that can hold their breath the longest ends up winning. Again, a challenge that feels very much like torture here, seeing the players going on the choke on water, and ends up being portrayed in this like very like horror style way, with again like this scary sort of music playing as the tide rises higher and higher, which again made this challenge very unique for the time. But along with that, we also get the first appearance here of another iconic, I guess, aspect of the show, that being Exile Island, where the person that goes out first in this challenge here ends up having to spend a night alone on Exile, a twist that ends up being a major staple of the teens of Survivor, one that, I'll be honest, I do find largely just fine, where it's really just a way to separate players and give a player an opportunity to get an idol, or at least that's how it's used later in the show's history, though at this current point, it's really just more so a survival segment here, to where, again, doesn't really do much for me. I don't particularly care about the survival aspects of the show, but again, it ends up being another one added to the season because we needed more of that. But again, this very much did feel like a test run, where I know there is some speculation that this idea stemmed from them loving Steph being alone on Oolong, and they put this together at the last second to test that concept out. Now, I don't know if I fully believe that, as again, I think for that story to be true, that would have been a very quick turnaround. Again, this is literally just a few days later, and obviously, again, it doesn't really take that much to set this up, but I do feel like this is not the type of thing that they would just like throw in randomly in the middle of the season. I feel like this is the type of thing that they would like add into the following season more so than just again like really rush this together here. So again, I personally think that this is probably something they've been concepting for a while. Again, it's not a particularly unique concept, the idea of having someone be exiled for a short period of time, and through that, again, I think this is probably something they had been cooking for a while and just felt like this was the time to utilize it. But again, the way that it is utilized here is something that I don't particularly like. Again, it's another aspect of the show that they're just putting more credence into challenge wins. Again, having someone's social capital in the game potentially actually be harmed because they perform the worst in a challenge, where again, because you end up getting last in the challenge, you have to spend time away from your other tribe members. For a while, again, it doesn't matter on this season because it's Janu. I do think if someone actually ended up being screwed over because they were sent to exile because of a poor challenge performance, I think that would have been, again, a very lacking result in my mind. But either way, here we do end up seeing Janu almost instantly dropping out, to where we do see the other tribe members just laughing at her, even after like Janu says that she doesn't know how to make fire. And we have Katie gloating about how happy she is that she doesn't have to go with them. Again, just kind of treating Janu terribly here. And we do see Jeff calling them out for this, saying that they're clearly not worried about you, only for Tom to say that's not true at all in his typical BS fashion. But ultimately, the challenge does come down to the three guys, with Tom pulling out the win here as expected, using his hands to create a snorkel. Again, a pretty prominent strategy for the challenge down the road. But with that, again, we obviously do get a pretty lengthy segment from Janu being an exile, which again, I just mostly found boring, but she does end up not wanting to give up because that's certainly something Janu would never do, and does end up making a fire on her own, which is a nice little moment for her, which again does also lead to some humor when she returns to camp and her just gloating about how much better she felt when she was alone, and people just being surprised by that, to where it also just felt like Janu, like Kobe, was just kind of over the people she was living with at this point. But as for the vote, it clearly ends up being between Steph and Janu, as previously alluded, to where again we do end up seeing Greg really pushing to take out Steph in this spot, with Greg ending up seemingly winning the day by the end, where it does feel very clear that Stephanie was going to go home by the time of tribal, with Tom even saying so in his confessional, despite the fact that he says that Steph going is not where his heart is, with Tom seemingly wanting Steph to say, as again, he seemingly recognized the fact that Steph was better for his game, but ends up letting her go to go with his alliance, which I think is something that for me personally really sours me on Tom's winning game, where again, to me, through this rewatch, I very much recognize the fact that despite the fact that there is this talk about how dominant of a player he is, he really actually is not that dominant. Again, there's not really many points in the game where Tom actually gets his way. And again, it feels like there's actually more situations where we see him wanting a certain thing, and instead he just goes with whatever his alliance ends up wanting. And the situations that he doesn't do that are situations where he's kind of strong-armed into not doing that. So again, despite the talk about how Tom was controlling his tribe for most of the season, I feel like that's not really the case. And I feel like we see him have very little agency in how he ends up navigating through the game, where we do see him again wanting stuff to say and not get his way in this position. And again, it feels like he's playing for a position where he's just on the bottom of his majority alliance. Again, seeing Tom not even get his way at points before his game goes off the rails in the end game has really sunk my overall opinion of his game, where again, it really just seems like he has so little control in the social strategy aspects of the game, and despite that, still comes off as very controlling and domineering in the camp life. Again, telling people what they can and can't do, and in turn, really just expediting the target on his back. Again, doing exactly what he said he wouldn't do at the very beginning of the season. I feel like he's too busy exerting his will in situations where it simply doesn't matter, over times that it does matter in the actual game. But beyond that, we actually don't even get much from Stephanie in this episode, outside of her being rightfully worried after everyone tells her that's Janu, with her recognizing that they're clearly lying to her, leading to a very notable tribal here where the Koror members don't even try to hide the fact that Steph is going home. But we do get a lot of talk here about Janu, with her talking about how she doesn't feel like she belongs and how she was better off on exile, leading to her saying that there's no reason to keep her and that they can get rid of her, with Janu clearly wanting to quit in this spot, which does lead to Steph being incensed at this, saying that she doesn't quit anything and that it kills her that someone could care less if they were here when she would kill to be here. And this does end up leading to Jeff kind of butting in at this point, saying to Janu that it's like you want to go home, and Janu saying that she is satisfied and got everything she wanted from the experience and wouldn't care less if she left tonight, to where Steph just outright says to her, well, then you don't deserve to be here, and that they're voting her out because she showed too much heart and will, which again, the show's clearly trying to make her come off as sympathetic here, but again, to me, it does feel like Stephanie's on this massive high horse here. But then we get to the more controversial aspects of this tribal, which is where Jeff essentially goads Janu into quitting, again asking her what is the difference between asking to be voted out and laying down your torch right now, with Janu proceeding to agree and quit the game to keep Steph in the game, where we do get a funny reaction to that with Steph saying, no, not just for me, like clearly not wanting to be associated with this. But again, there was a lot of talk about how Jeff did convince Janu to quit the game in order to keep Stephanie in the game, and yeah, I think he does, which does lead to a funny moment that we'll talk about the reunion show. But obviously this does feel like production just fully putting their hands on the scales in order to save Stephanie. Though with that said, again, I don't think this is a position where they got Janu to quit just unpromptedly, as again, I do think Janu wanted to quit, but seemingly just didn't understand that she could without major ramifications, where, again, it seemed like Janu was worried about her quitting would mean that she wouldn't be on the jury and she would lose her stipend. So again, I know the rumors supposedly they stopped down on Tribal and explained to Janu that her quitting, that they would allow her to keep those things even if she quit, which again sets a precedent for down the road, which again, maybe I'll talk about once we get to Nicaragua. But it clearly leads to Janu here not being that demonized for her quit here. Again, not nearly to the extent that Austin was in Pearl Islands, where again, while we do see Jeff laying down her torch and constantly mentioning the fact that she quit when naming the jury members, production here, again, clearly wanted this to happen and clearly went out of their way to properly explain to Janu that yes, you can quit, so that Steph would stay another day, which again, I'm actually not opposed to, realistically. Again, Janu was just kind of fodder there. I think we were just kind of wasting time with Janu still there, where I think her just staying in the game would have just led to more frustrations in how the end game played out, to where, again, I'm perfectly fine with Steph staying another round, giving it another shot, and to be fair, obviously it doesn't work out anyway, but I think it's just another thing that, again, ends up being a unique aspect of this season that doesn't really take much away from it. But again, with that, we lose Janu, and Janu was there. Again, Janu ended up getting a very quiet edit across the season. I mean, she was somewhat there in the premiere, but beyond that, again, just kind of under the radar in Koror until the point where she gets sick and just wants to quit the game. And then from that point on, she's just kind of miserable the entire way. For a while, again, we do get some fun moments from her fight with Katie. It's I don't feel like Janu brought that much to the show, which makes it even more shocking the fact that she was supposedly in the running to come back from Micronesia, which I don't really understand why they would want that. But again, we almost got a Janu 2.0, as I didn't feel like we really needed that. But with that, we then move on to episode 11, which just ends up extending this Steph going home storyline for another episode, as she's clearly going home for the majority of it. And while there theoretically could have been a flip along the way, it never felt like it was practically happening. But again, we do start the episode with a more ominous line from Greg, with him regretting not getting rid of Steph the round before, and says that I hope it doesn't come back to haunt us, which, again, it will haunt you, which, again, felt like setup first fall, even though, again, to be fair, it's not like Janu leaving there necessarily doomed his game. But also here we end up continuing on with Steph being on a high horse, saying it was wrong that they would vote her out when Janu didn't want to be there. Oh, well, we see Tom doing his thing of just blatantly trying to suck up to Stephanie here and putting his immunity necklace around her neck, saying that his immunity was mute and it was really her that had immunity, because, again, that's such a Tom thing to do. And it's also funnily contrasted with Steph now doubting her 4-person alliance, as obviously she knows that they would have been willing to turn on her the previous round. And we do see her confronting Tom and Katie about this, with Tom saying that he's looking out for her but can't expose himself because he's obviously done a very good job at not becoming a threat throughout the rest of the season. Or again, I think it's another point of Tom, again, talking a good game but not necessarily enacting on it, and we do end up seeing a lot of talk about how big of a threat Tom is, with Tom seemingly being aware at how Stephanie is the shield for him and that once she goes, he's in danger, though despite that, he just does nothing to change any of that, outside of, again, just going to Koror and telling him that it's his strength and challenges that got him here, and keep that in mind. Talking about how his game was revealed because he was playing for the tribe and hopes they don't hold that against him, which, again, I think this is just a terrible way of handling this. Again, him trying to guilt them into keeping him around is just something that almost never works, where it usually leads to them being incensed at the fact that you think that you're the only reason why they're there, and through that want to turn on you even more. Though also the reality is that no one wanted to take Tom to the end anyway. I don't think anybody outside of maybe Karen in this endgame stretch would have actually wanted to take Tom to the end, though obviously I don't think this helped with any of that. But again, it's fine that we get more content about how even Ian is talking now about how big of a target Tom is, with him continuously winning challenges, and Katie saying that his plea did him nothing and that it's time to switch things up, leading to a segment of the women coming together, us seeing Steph, Katie, and Jen talking about it being a 4v3, and if they can get Karen on board, they can take control of the game, which, again, probably would have been the right call for their games here. Again, I think they obviously have a much better chance of winning against each other than they do against Tom and Ian in particular, probably even Greg also, to where, again, I think them flipping the script here would have been the optimal move, though a large issue stems here from the fact that I don't know if any of these women would have been able to stick together anyway, as, again, I think they all had very different agendas, all of them having like a certain guy they wanted to protect. Again, Katie with Ian, Jen with Greg, Karen with Tom, to where even if they somehow maneuvered some sort of flip during this round, I don't feel like it's an alliance that actually would have stuck, though again, it would have been nice to see them come together for a big blindside here, but they don't, because Karen sucks. kind of, where I actually do believe from Extra Press that I've seen that the reality is actually that Karen was actually the first person to approach the women about working together, and she was the one that actually wanted to get the women to turn against the men, only for them to initially dismiss it, only to then kind of turn around on it by the point that we see here, to where again we see Katie considering it, though at the same time. And while we do see Katie again being the one that would really prop up why that Karen is the reason why this won't work, the reality is supposedly it was actually Katie that didn't want this to go through, and she was the main reason why it didn't go through, mainly because of her hatred of Karen, that she hated Karen so much that she was just not willing to risk the chance that Karen would go on to win the game, which I do think is a fundamental issue of Katie's game, where again, I'll praise Katie's game at points down the road. I think she had very good positioning in the game, especially to get to the end. I think the big issue is that she didn't really have the win equity, and I think the fact that she is like so against Karen, probably the only person that she can win in this end game stretch, I think is such a bad call for her. But again, by the end of this, we don't even see Karen on board with this either, as we do proceed to see Tom roping in Karen, which again, I think is probably one of the best moves Tom does, with again, him knowing that he's in danger, even thinking that there might be a flip against him this round, as he continuously has won challenges, and if he doesn't win immunity this round, which he doesn't, again, there's serious reason to think that he would be voted out, where, again, I think this is a correct call from Tom, obviously, and I do think pulling in Karen here is probably one of the best moves he makes across the entire season. It's something that gives him a little bit more insulation in the game, as Karen's seemingly the only person that's actually truly looking out for him. For a while, again, the likes of like Ian and Katie definitely wanted to bring him further into the game. Again, no one genuinely wanted to go to the end with Tom. So it feels like Karen's like the only person that never genuinely campaigned against Tom towards this end game stretch. And again, I think that is something that is very impressive about Tom's game. I think an issue for me is the fact that I don't feel like Tom actually utilizes Karen enough. Where again, I think Karen was someone that didn't really have many options in this end game stretch, to where if I was Tom, I would be 100% keeping Karen around for deep into the game. Again, somebody that's easy to beat in challenges, somebody that also doesn't really have any other connections to really use against him, and someone that could be this massive asset for Tom, but despite that, he's just, again, kind of willing to let her go for a lot of this end game stretch. And only keeping her at 6 because, again, he essentially banged over the head with the fact that he needs to, and then at final 5, ends up actually just letting her go, where it just once again highlights to me just how little influence he actually had in how he navigated through the game outside of the fact that he just won challenges. Sure, again, while I think it's very impressive the fact that he did this initial setup and again was able to insulate him a little bit more, it still was never going to be enough to actually get him to the end, and I think he could have done a lot more of Karen here to better his odds at that, and only from just not really bother. But following that, we do end up getting the return of the Survivor auction here, which was absent since the Amazon somehow, where I think when looking at how the Amazon auction played out, I could see that. Again, I could see their annoyance at how the players there made this deal to not bid against each other on that season. That may have spooked them from using it for these next couple seasons, where like in the Amazon, we do see them having a bevy of covered items to counter that possibility, and here we do end up seeing Jen win the first covered item, with it obviously being good, and that being a ice cream sundae, where again there's over-the-top music playing as she opens it, which is funny. While we then get a lot of collaboration here, which is something I do miss from the modern auctions, and while I get that you can't really do it because of the game advantages, and again that could greatly favor the majority, I did find it fun to see the likes of Ian and Greg making deals, with like Ian winning spaghetti and Greg paying him $20 for a bite, during which we also get a funny moment of Ian hugging Jeff and Jeff saying, "Wow, you reek," which has always been funny to me. Also here we end up seeing Steph and Karen working together, which felt like a kind of random duo there, but again they end up winning an item and are offered to trade, to which they humorously end up sniffing the items, with Jeff clearly being annoyed at that, but they end up getting a burger and fries, making the right call there. But again, we do culminate the auction here at the reveal of letters from home, exactly what Tom wanted, where we do see him already getting emotional and bidding in silence, which I always found to be somewhat notable there. But again, he ends up winning it and cries over his drawing of his kids, which is again obviously sympathetic content for him. So by the end, it's a largely forgettable auction, one that felt kind of rushed, though it does have a couple humorous moments here and there. Though following it, we actually do get a decent amount of follow-up sequences around it. Again, we got more people being able to buy their letters for the same price, to which we end up getting personal content for Steph, with her talking about her parents and boyfriend because we needed more Steph content, all while we then end up seeing Ian finally bathing after Jeff's comment because we needed that. And through that, we also see him bathing with Greg, and they obviously end up playing this up of, oh, it's so funny that two guys are bathing together, I guess. Anyway, we get to the immunity challenge, where players are given 5 tiles each and have to knock out each of their tiles, though because the tiles are close to each other, other players can accidentally knock out one of your own tells for you, which again, I think is actually a mostly fun challenge. Obviously, again, it's another one of these that has a bit of an issue where, again, if the majority kind of gangs up on the minority here, it can just be one that, again, ices out those players. But again, we don't see that actually happening here, but we do end up seeing Steph just kind of sucking at the challenge and then only getting one tile by the end. All while this ends up being a challenge that Tom is actually not good at. Or again, if only this was one of the last few challenges of the season. But through that, we end up seeing Ian landing every shot here, pulling out the win. Again, being the only person this entire season to win a immunity challenge outside of Tom. And with that, obviously, Tom ends up being vulnerable here in a spot where we do see him being worried about being taken out, and do see the women finally approaching Karen, with the show portraying this as, again, Katie truly considering making the move against Tom here, which, again, wasn't true. But again, we do see her, again, at least like talking about it, which, again, probably not the smartest call realistically to tell people about the idea of taking out Tom if you're not actually going to take out Tom. But, and we see her going to Karen, asking her about voting out Tom, only for Karen to say that she needs to think about it, and then rats her back out to Tom. And Tom, in his infinite wisdom, responds to that by saying, "Why are you telling me this? And why are you not just siding with the girls?" Again, one of the greatest players in the history of Survivor. But obviously, this paranoia about the women coming together really just ends up solidifying the vote against Steph even more to stop a potential women's alliance. But again, we do end up seeing some more drama here from Ian informing Katie about what he was told from Tom, and that Karen ratted her out, which does lead to a really iconic confessional to me of Katie saying that they can't get a female alliance together because Karen sucks, which no lies detected. And I do love Katie's frankness in this confessional, but again, really funny that the show is portraying it in this way where, again, by Katie's own rationale, that would mean that she herself sucks. But this does lead to Katie campaigning against Tom the Ian here, with Katie accurately being worried about Tom just winning out and that he would demolish everybody in a jury vote, to where, while Ian is not necessarily on board with making the move at this point, as again, he probably shouldn't, as again, Tom is someone that is still an ally and shield for him, especially over the likes of someone like a Greg. It does have Ian, again, seemingly considering taking a shot at Tom, which again, we see him do more to enact that down the road, where again, it just further emphasizes to me just how bad Tom's endgame position was. Though again, to be fair to Tom though, despite his endgame being pretty bad, I do think he actually does decent work to get to that final 5 position in a spot where, again, I think him maintaining these relationships with this 5-person alliance, that allows him to get close enough to the end to win out. And again, the fact that he didn't take him out at final 6 and final 7 where he doesn't have immunity, despite the fact that he had won the previous 2 immunities, again, I think that is actually pretty impressive. The final 6 one probably more so, as again, here you obviously have Steph, who's again this massive target also. But I know there are stories about how part of the way that Tom was able to do this at this point in the game was by threatening his jury vote, where supposedly he would go to Katie and tell her that if she ever flipped against him, that he wouldn't vote for her, and that he would get Ian and Stephanie to not vote for her either, which again, obviously is this strong army tactic that again, Tom is kind of known for, but one that again, I just don't think is effective on those seasons. There's another one of these tactics that again, seemingly works for him, but one that I would not say is necessarily the optimal play, because again, it's just another one that would piss people off to think that you have their game in their hands and that you have that much influence on the jury, to where, and we see so many times in Survivor and Big Brother history where threats like this are just so ineffective, but again, it seemingly works out for him in this spot. But either way, we get the tribal, which was pretty boring, and again, they have to fake us out into thinking that Ian turned against Tom, where he says that he's voting out the hardest competitor he has ever met. Though again, it's clearly him talking about Stephanie, and Stephanie goes out unanimously here. In a spot where Stephanie doesn't even vote for Tom, so again, I'll give Tom, I guess, some credit for that. But either way, we lose Stephanie, and obviously Stephanie, massive star in this season. Again, one of the most popular Survivor players up to this point. And again, really the first like post All-Star star of the show. Again, being this big inspiration for younger women, and again, kind of being this like definitive female competitor, to where again, I think Stephanie definitely deserves a lot of recognition for her impact on the show, especially at this point. But I think when looking at the season more practically, again, she's essentially just another Rupert, one that again definitely has some more questionable things in her run. Again, moments where she does come off on a massive high horse, and I think if the show was edited a bit differently, you would think Stephanie's not as likable, and again, we see that in Guatemala. But obviously, again, her story on this season is just so unique, so memorable, and one that again makes a lot of sense why she was so popular at the time. Even though again, I don't think she's necessarily the greatest player. I think she made a lot of strategic missteps on Oolong, but I still think one that would have seemed to have a glimmer of potential until we see her on the following season where you realize, oh, she is actually kind of lacking in most aspects of the game. And now for episode 12, which ends up starting this really strong end stretch of the season where, again, Palau's a season that, again, for the most part, I don't particularly love. I think a lot of the season is based around things that I personally don't care about. However, I do think this endgame stretch is very, very strong. But we do start off the episode with content revolving around Tom and him talking with Karen, telling her that he can't step outside of his 5-person alliance, aka that he's gonna vote her out. Again, he's telling her this at the beginning of the round, which again, why is he doing this? Where, again, telling Karen she's gone and he isn't going to save her here is just so bad. And again, to be fair, Karen obviously doesn't end up doing much with this. Again, doesn't really turn against them in this spot. But again, also just like, why are you doing this? Again, letting Karen go here. Again, Karen's someone that is a pretty great number for you. Certainly a better number for you than the likes of Greg and Jen, who are still in the game. Which again, we do see Karen trying to convince him of that. And he obviously eventually gets on board with that later in the episode. But again, why does he even need convincing of that? But really, if I was Tom, again, I would be going all in on wanting to go to the end with Karen, even over Katie, especially as you would just learn that Katie was considering going against you. And while it would have been really difficult for him to keep Karen around without getting Ian and Katie's approval, and Katie was vehemently against Karen because they just didn't like each other, I do think this also just shows the failings of Tom as a player and that he wasn't able to maneuver through his endgame in a more optimal way. But either way, before the reward challenge, we do get a line from Ian about how he promised Katie that he would take her on reward if he wins it, which again feels really out of place here, but later ends up actually becoming some ironic foreshadowing for the following episode. But the reward challenge here is one that ends up being pretty integral to how the season ends up playing out, with that being the return of the coconut chop challenge, which is obviously very apt that this challenge has a major impact once again here, where obviously Karen is the first one out, but after her, we do get some pretty interesting results here, with the 5 having to go against each other and with Tom ending up being the first out there. Again, an indication that he'd be in danger had his group actually gotten down to 5. But following that, we then proceed to see Greg, Jen, and Katie go after Ian, making him feel like he's on the bottom as well. And again, that's despite the fact that it did seem like Katie was genuinely loyal to Ian. But again, this ends up really getting Ian's gears turning. But once down to Greg, Jen, and Katie, we do see Greg asking Jen if she'll be okay if he goes with Katie, as I guess him and Katie had a deal to take each other on reward, to which we get some classic Jeff here and him saying, wow, you asked for permission. He's like, guess that's a thing men can't do. But Greg does end up taking Katie out in this spot and ultimately ends up winning the reward here, taking Jen and Katie along with him, telling Tom and Ian that he'll pay them back, only for Tom to say, no, we'll pay you back, which obviously is played off as a joke here, but I don't think it was fully a joke, as when we get back to camp, we do see Tom and Ian clearly being pissed over how this challenge played out and talk about having lost control in the game, which obviously incentivizes on them to finally turn against the 5, which again I think is the correct call from both point of views. Now obviously knowing that Tom ends up winning out anyway, this obviously would have been the last opportunity to get Tom out, and obviously in retrospective would have been optimal to get Tom out here before he can win out. But considering the positions that they were in, I do think for Ian, again, I do think this is the correct call to deal with the Greg and Jen duo before he deals with Tom, where again at least Tom was very much planning on taking Ian down to 3, where Ian would still be in the spot where, again, if he wins final immunity, votes out Tom, he wins the game. Also, Katie is more loyal to him, who is the intended person to take the 3 as well, to where, again, for Ian, like, actually just playing out this final 3 with Tom and Katie is not the worst thing in the world, even though there are obviously some better paths that we see him attempt to take. But again, I do think taking out Greg here is pretty integral for his endgame path, where, again, having Greg still there makes it very rocky and puts pretty much all of his faith into Katie, where if Katie is not on his side, he's pretty screwed. And I do think both end up making a pretty optimal play here in deciding to turn on Greg. And with that, again, we do finally see Tom taking Karen seriously, where, again, the way that the challenge played out, it looked like Katie was fully with Greg and Jen, to which Tom calls her Shady Lady Katie, which, again, I don't know if that was necessarily the case, as I do feel like Katie, well, again, never intended to go to the end with Tom. I don't think she had her full mind made up on when exactly she was going to cut Tom from the game. But again, this perception that Katie is with with Greg and Jen here, ends up making them formulate this plan in a way that I don't think was the most optimal way they could have played this, in that they essentially decide to just not tell Katie about the plan until the very last second, which is some very wonky management of Katie, especially from Ian's point of view, who, again, his entire game kind of relies on Katie. So for him to essentially be willing to strong arm Katie in this spot to where, again, obviously she's not going to take that particularly well, again, that was definitely a very questionable move. But again, here we do see Tom and Ian being fully on board with Karen, saying that there's nothing Katie can do but go to rocks, which, again, she was obviously very unlikely to do, especially when, again, she's essentially riding the middle. It's like, why would she risk her own game in that position? And again, I think the entire notion of just leaving her out of the vote until the very last second is just so dumb, especially at this point, like before the involvement of idols in the game, where again, there's no downsides to telling Katie about this plan, as again, worst case scenario is that they go to rocks. Even then, I think Katie would have just said sure anyway. But I do really love these scenes. Again, seeing Tom and Ian recognizing them having to make this big move and creating this big plot for when the players come back from award and talking about how exactly to act, which again just felt so reminiscent of something you would see in modern Survivor. And seeing this like big move come together, and this probably being like one of the most bold moves in history of the show up to this point, where again, being willing to go to a tie and go to rocks for the first time since Survivor Marquesas, and again, even then, it wasn't even in the same context that going to rocks is now, again, doing so at the final 6, where more than just one person is going to have to put their games on the line here. And again, we've never really seen rocks be a true consideration in the time since, where again, I do think seeing Pascal going out from a rock draw in a spot where again, he got no votes against him, again, really spooked a lot of players who obviously never wanting to put their entire games into the hands of luck. And every single time we've seen it mentioned beforehand, it was never really taken seriously. Again, someone like Jenna obviously mentioned it in All-Stars, but had no intention of actually going to rocks for Rupert. But here again, we see Tom and Ian both being fully willing to put their games on the line here to force Greg out of the game, which again felt like such a progressive move for this point in Survivor. But again, the reward itself ends up being an overnight stay on a yacht, which felt eerily similar to Sean's reward in Survivor Borneo, to which again, he ended up getting a surprise visit from his dad. And what do you know? As we're seeing him get a massage, we have a guy sneaking in the place of Greg's masseuse and smacking him on the ass, as masseuses do, with the reveal that it's Greg's best friend, Greg. With Jen and Katie's family members showing up immediately following this, with this being again the family visit, which really comes out of nowhere on this season, where again, I do find it very strange that again, they didn't reveal this beforehand or even like foreshadow that this would be happening here. But again, they get to spend the day at a lagoon with dolphins, which again, I'm sure it was a cool moment for them to share that with their families. And realistically, the scene was just, again, kind of boring to me. That is until we see some strategy with them talking about going to the final 3 together, where Katie obviously would have been the swing vote had they gone down the 5, with her being the best position in the game at this point, though to be fair, more so in a kingmaker role, more than her actually having any true agency to go on to win the game. But here we do end up having Katie detailing her strategy to stick to the people that are making the decisions, and once they lose power, she'll flip to the new power, which again is a good strategy for Big Brother, where again, this is essentially her playing a floater strategy, but again, on Survivor, a game that I don't think rewards that style of strategy as much. So while I did come out of my rewatch here being higher on Katie as a player than I was previously, I do feel like the strategy is again one that ends up ultimately being a losing one. I don't think it's one that again attaches itself to Survivor particularly well, because in that spot, that essentially means you're just enabling people that have more direct control in the game than you, and it just makes it feel like you're more of a follower than someone that's actually making things happen, which again, I think matters a lot more on Survivor than it does on Big Brother, where Big Brother, again, you have this constantly shifting power, and through that, again, there is definitely some merit to playing in this style of way as a way to avoid being targeted in the case that the power shifts, which it very often does. But again, Survivor is a game, especially at this point in the show, where power doesn't shift that often. Instead, it just makes you look like your player that's simply just allowing the bigger players to make it to the end. And the problem is obviously the fact that she can't beat any of them, especially considering how poorly she treated some of the jury members as well. So again, she's really missing that killer instinct that she needed to win here. Again, having the ability to cut those big threats at the end, which again, wouldn't have mattered anyway, as again, obviously Tom and Ian just win out in comps no matter what happens here. But again, even if things had gone exactly the way that she wanted them to be, that essentially leads to her getting final 2 with Ian, who would proceed to beat her in a spot where again, she did have a winning scenario by this point and simply doesn't even try to go to that winning scenario. But it is here where we see the 3 agree to vote out Karen. because, again, they want to go down to the 5, which, again, for Katie is very damning, as, again, that is the only person that she can beat at the end. But also here, we do see them say that if Karen wins immunity, the plan is to take Tom out, which I do think Katie would have considered, though, to be fair, I don't think she actually would have pulled the trigger in this spot, where I think more than likely this vote just plays out the same. As while I do think Katie was very willing to cut Tom if necessary, I do feel like this would have been a spot where, again, Tom, Ian, and Karen would have been a lockstep, and I don't think Katie would have been willing to go to rocks to take Tom out here, especially considering the fact that obviously Ian would not be on board. But once they return to camp, we do end up seeing some focus around Karen, who ends up being tasked to continue to act like she's going home and don't act chipper, with her saying that she's a very good actress. And she was fine. Again, she didn't give away the plan, so that's something. But Ian does say that she should win an Academy Award, which, I mean, come on. But here we do get some focus on Tom after he learns that he missed out on the family visit, with him talking about it as his worst fear, and him getting emotional once again portraying him as this likable family man. Oh, wow, we do get some personal content for Greg, again, for first time of the season, where really outside of this, Greg did come off as this largely game body figure, though we do see him getting emotional over his friend leaving, and he gets to talk about the passing of his dad, which, I mean, for this point in the show, I feel like we don't really get that many of these style of personal segments that talk about, again, a tragedy in the person's life, where, again, interesting that we get this here, even though obviously it's more so just set up for him to go home. But this takes us to the immunity challenge. Surprisingly, the second chance challenge, which typically is saved for the car reward challenge, but it's here for immunity. And I've always liked this challenge for some reason, where here we end up seeing them have 5 rounds. Each round, the last person to finish gets eliminated, with each round essentially just being a redo of a previous challenge, where, again, I've always liked how this is a challenge that really tests out a wide number of skills, though unsurprisingly, we end up seeing Tom and Ian be in the top 2 here. Again, I never would have guessed that, but the final round here ends up being the return of the shooting challenge. And what do you know? Tom sucks at it once again, with Ian winning his second immunity here, and with Tom again winning every immunity after this. Again, this ends up being the last time that they could have gotten him out, though obviously because of Greg and Jen thinking it was easier to make their move at 5, and again, Ian having Greg and Jen as a target ahead of Tom at this point, it does leave Tom completely safe for this round, which, again, is minorly impressive. Even though, again, I don't know how necessarily intentional it was from Tom, as, again, I think he thought he was probably in danger. But following this, we end up seeing Tom, Ian, and Karen going along with their plan, with lots of content from Greg, who clearly doesn't suspect a thing here. Though we do get a funny little moment after we hear him saying that it's going to be an uneventful night, only for Ian to respond by saying that tonight's going to be interesting. And we have Greg saying, interesting? Only for Tom to bail him out in that spot, saying it's always interesting, which, again, I do find this to be a really funny moment. And again, as much as I will dog on Tom's game at points, again, he is very good at the little thing, with this being an example of that, while Ian also is very bad at the little things here. So again, he definitely has a lot of these like sloppy moments, and later ones end up being pretty detrimental to his game, though again, in this spot, Tom's able to seemingly clean it up for him. But again, following this is where we do end up seeing Ian be the one to tell Katie about the plan, again, at the last second, again, telling her that he is forcing a tie and they're going to rocks, which ends up shocking Katie and really ends up pissing her off, saying it's unfair and that she's in a good spot. And again, really, like, to be fair, she's still in a good spot, even if Greg ends up going home. If not, actually, it probably has more influence in the game. But I do get her being annoyed at this. Again, obviously not being looped into the plan until it was already formulated, and again, just being told what to do here, while also this being a spot where, again, her being the sole person to flip against Greg and Jen ends up potentially losing their jury votes. Though, again, it's not like she had much of a chance if she had voted out Karen anyway. But again, she gets on board with the vote here. But again, the way that Ian ends up strong-arming her here does end up being a major source of conflict between the two and for the next few rounds, and kind of starts this downward trajectory for Ian in this end game, which largely becomes this tragic storyline for him that, while obviously I do feel bad for how Ian's endgame ends up playing out, I do actually think this is probably one of the most riveting aspects of this season, and one of the reasons why I do love the endgame of this season as much as I do. But either way, we get the tribal, where once again we end up seeing Jeff being kind of annoyed at how Greg asked Jen for permission because he has the point that out every time he sees it. But we do get to the vote with another notable Ian voting confessional here and calling Greg the dark horse. And it's time for the dark horse to ride off into the sunset. Either way, we do get a 4-2 Greg vote here with him being blindsided in the spot saying, "You guys are good." Oh, well, we see like Kobe laughing from the jury. And again, this obviously being propped up as this major blindside, probably the biggest blindside of the season, where realistically, again, a 4-2 vote against Greg is not anything too special. But to be fair, I mean, this is a season that doesn't really have the most dynamic gameplay in the world. But with that, again, we lose Greg. And again, I think Greg is a very underrated player in Survivor history. I feel like he's one that, obviously, if you've watched Palau more recently, you will probably mention the fact that he is an underrated player. But I think most people just simply don't remember who Greg is. And again, I think Greg is somebody that, again, definitely had a lot of potential in Survivor. Again, someone that was a very well-rounded player. I think someone that, again, gets kind of overshadowed on this season, where, again, we have the likes of Tom and Ian just being better physically, also just better characters. Well, also, Greg is somebody that, again, the game doesn't really just work out for him. Again, I think he gets pretty unlucky at points, and too fair, I think there's other points where, again, I think he should have made the move against Tom and Ian during the Kobe vote and doesn't there, and then, again, gets kind of screwed by Janu quitting, and maybe, like, gets a little bit too tunnel vision taking Stephanie out. But, again, I think Greg is somebody that, again, definitely has a lot of skill for the game. Again, we see him probably being the most fluid player on Crore, but again, never really ends up using that fluidity to his benefit. But again, I do think if Greg were to return, which again won't happen at this point, but again, if you ever were to play again, I think there would be a lot of potential there. But again, we'll obviously never really see it. But with that, we then move on to episode 13. Another, again, pretty strong episode where while the overall result is not as interesting as the previous one, again, we do get a lot of interesting drama along the way. But again, the episode does start with Jen being shocked at the Greg vote. Despite this, she actually does end up handling her reaction to the vote pretty well, with her somehow being able to just fall back under the radar for this round, with, again, no one talking about taking her out, despite the fact that it should have been the very obvious move to do so, which, again, I would largely attribute this to her relationship with Katie, but also Katie's dislike of Karen, where, again, if one of the guys were to not go home during this round, I feel like it was always going to be Karen over Jen because of Katie's influence over this round. Even though, again, obviously if Katie were trying to win, she shouldn't be doing that. But here we do end up also seeing Ian being worried about Karen, with her having more loyalty to Tom over him. And through that is worried about the women coming together to take him out, which was, again, pretty unlikely to happen here, with, again, Katie seemingly being actually loyal to Ian. Though, again, he obviously doesn't end up helping himself over the course of this round. But again, it is here where we do get to see Tom telling Karen that he wants to take her to the end. Essentially, at this point, planning on swapping her out with Katie, who had already been his planned final two, where an underreported story about the Tom-Ian dynamic is that despite the fact that they were very close, they actually never did have a proper final two, and never seemed to actually intend on taking each other to the final two, where they more so actually had a final three deal alongside Katie, with both of them pretty openly knowing that they were going to be cutting each other for Katie, which is part of why they were so willing to go so deep into the game together, with Tom fully planning on going through this deal at this point, while, again, Ian does until around now. Again, it does end up putting them in a spot where all they have to do is essentially just beat the other in final immunity and they win the game, which, again, isn't the worst position in the world to be in, especially for Ian, who, again, is closer to Katie, to where while Katie is very unlikely to win final immunity, it does still put the odds in his favor. So again, it's not the worst arrangement for Ian, and again, we do end up seeing Tom finally deciding to do something to better his odds in putting Karen in there instead of Katie. Mind you, he's more so doing it just because he distrusts Katie at this point. But again, I think this is the correct call to try to get to the end game with Karen, but obviously it's just a bit too late here anyway, with Katie being too well connected to the likes of Ian and Jen. But also, I don't feel like he really fights hard enough for this anyway, to where, again, this ends up being another position where he just backs down and doesn't really fight for Karen to stay. While we also see him here in this spot having a bit of a misread on the situation to begin with, him thinking that there's no reason for Ian to want to keep Katie around, which really shows him being kind of aloof to how close Ian and Katie are in the game. It does finally cut from that line to us seeing Ian, Katie, and Jen agreeing to work together and at least at this point, take out Karen, though we do end up seeing Jen campaigning to take out Tom here instead, which was nice to see from Jen, who again seemed to be a pretty passive player up to this point. But again, this just ends up leading to Ian saying that he doesn't know yet what he's going to do, to where, again, I am pretty unsure if Ian would have pulled the trigger this early, especially when you have Karen as this like very easy vote and still this person that you can take out to weaken Tom and not completely break your word. I do feel like at the end of the day, he probably would have kept Tom around during this round, which obviously would have been the wrong call for him. But again, he never gets the opportunity anyway. During an in the lead up to the reward challenge, we do actually get some focus on, again, Tom and Ian talking through who they should take on the reward challenge should they win, which, again, obviously one of the two will win. To which we do see Tom actively saying that they can't pick each other as they need to keep the women separated to lower the risk of them coming together and voting one of them, which, again, a correct call from Tom and one that surely Ian will go through with. But here we do end up seeing Ian agreeing to it, but saying that he'll take Katie, with Tom talking about this as a dumb move, saying doing that means we lose Karen, and how can you trust Katie? Which, again, I do think this fully shows Tom just being kind of unaware how close Katie and Ian are in the game. But again, we do get the reveal of the reward challenge, and that it is the car challenge. So really outside that ends up being a largely unnotable challenge of them just having to collect mileage markers, having to attach them to the right cities based on how far away they are from Palau. Again, pretty boring. But here we end up seeing Ian pull out the win, and with the winner here also getting a barbecue feast and an overnight stay. Again, obviously Ian here is going to pick Katie because he said so beforehand, right? And also he talked about in the last episode about him having a deal with Katie that they'll take each other on reward. So again, with that, he ends up taking Tom. Again, the person who literally told him to not pick him, with, again, Tom being annoyed here, which, again, ends up being this funny moment, but also just, again, a terrible move from Ian. That, again, not only annoys Tom, but also gives the women incentive to take him out, and also burns his relationship with Katie, to where, while it works out for him by the end, this is just a completely unforced error that he did, because, again, he seemingly wanted to, one, hang out with Tom, but also wanted Tom to potentially get a car, where, again, it's funny that, obviously, they had just seen Survivor All-Stars, and Survivor All-Stars, Rob picked Amber, and Amber got a car. Again, I think there was this assumption that they were going to do a similar thing here. Again, why would you think that? Or again, I wouldn't think that they would do that on a non-All-Star season, but again, even then, why do that when it's so detrimental to your game? Again, why risk your game just for, like, the chance that there is a second car that's given out? And again, considering how the season plays out anyway, Tom's going to get a car anyway. He'll be fine. But anyway, again, the reward itself ends up being mostly boring here outside of Ian and Tom talking about Ian's move, with Tom now saying that he's relying on Ian to pull Katie back in, with him now seemingly being back on board with going to 3 with Katie. For some reason, again, he really shouldn't, as it just puts Tom in a way more dangerous position for Final Four than he would have been had it been Karen there instead, but whatever, I guess. Anyway, back at camp, we obviously end up seeing the women getting to talk, with Katie being upset here, saying it feels like she just lost her best friend, with this being a pretty negative look for Ian, with him clearly making the wrong move, and one that gets called immature. But again, Katie proceeds to tell the women about the final 3 that she has with Tom and Ian, which, again, should be pretty obvious, though, again, we do end up seeing Jen shocked at this, saying that she's now more wary of Katie for playing a game that she didn't know she was playing, which, again, you would think would garner Katie some jury respect, but it obviously doesn't. But this does lead to the typical talk about taking Tom out, only for Karen to say that she doesn't know if it's better for her. Which, I mean, to be fair, I mean, Karen can't win anyway, so going alongside Tom does actually increase her odds of making it to Final 2, so again, it's not necessarily the wrong call. Though again, practically, I'm not even sure if this would have gone through, even if Tom didn't win immunity, as again, obviously we see Katie back down to save Ian by the end of the round. Now, obviously, the question would be, would she do the same for Tom? And again, I'm not entirely sure, but I do think there's reason to believe that, again, the final 5 here is, again, definitely a lot more rocky, especially in comparison to the final 4, where, again, I feel a lot more solidified in what would have happened there. But it's here where we do get to see why Karen does suck, as right as Tom and Ian arriving at camp, again, literally as they're still on their walk back, we end up seeing Karen sneak over to them and essentially just rat out the women to them. Though again, this ends up actually being a pretty fun scene, as she also in turn ends up confronting Tom and Ian on who is their real final three, with Karen asking Ian if it's me, you, and Tom, and Ian funnily responds to this by saying it's me, you, and Katie, only then correct it to me, you, and Tom. Again, right in front of Tom. Where again, this very much feels like this Freudian slip from Ian of him essentially leaking to them that his bigger priority is Katie. But also, again, through him leaving out Tom in his first go, this should have been a sign that, again, he was not planning on taking Tom much further into the game. But again, this does end up having Ian just kind of stammering around and not giving a solid answer to Karen, only for her to just leave frustrated. And we have Tom scolding him for giving away her vote and saying that you better be tight with Katie, only for us to see him approach Katie and for her to instantly reject him as well. Again, this seeming like a really bad day for Ian. Again, him literally calling it a horrible nightmare. And again, it really just feels like a spot where Ian's game is seemingly crumbling around him, though I do find it funny that this actually could have worked out to his favor. Again, completely unintentionally, but again, had Tom not won immunity in this spot and the women did end up flipping on Tom, it actually would have put Ian in this prime position to just win out and likely get to the end of Katie and win against her. So again, despite the fact that obviously none of this is intentional, and again, it is pretty bad play on paper, it kind of could have led to him kind of stumbling into a better position. But again, this ends up being the start of Ian's tragic endgame stretch here, with him being shocked that this is the reaction when it was just the reward for dinner. Whereas does lead to him trying to talk to Katie once again, where this ends up leading to a pretty emotional conversation, way more emotional than you would think over a reward pick, where again, we essentially end up seeing Ian begging for her to take him back, with Katie being really upset over how he lied to her and how he didn't think about how that would make her feel, and she now feels embarrassed. Again, all this feels like a couple spat here, and it leads to Ian literally getting on the ground and saying, I'm sorry, and says, if you want me to step out of this game, I will. Which I will say, I do think if that was done in the real world, this would be a very icky way of manipulation. But again, they end up hugging it out to where this seemingly ends up repairing their relationship enough to where Katie ends up sticking by Ian, really until the end of the game, despite the fact that we do see her frustrations with him throughout. But again, I found this to be really interesting TV here. Again, see the complexities of this Ian-Katie relationship, to where while obviously ideally I would have liked this relationship to be set up probably a bit better in the edit, where it really isn't until this endgame stretch that we know just how close Katie and Ian are. I do think just the amount of emotions emanating throughout this conversation really makes this a super notable scene to me. And I do find it funny how it ends with Ian saying to her that he'll try his damnest and not be stupid again, which won't work out. But following this, we do end up getting some focus on Tom's side of the story, where again, we end up seeing Tom strong-arming Katie, as previously alluded, telling her that if she votes out one of the guys, they'll just win immunities and she's gone, that she wouldn't even make it the final two, which again makes Tom come off as a bit of a dick here, essentially telling her that she can't win and that she really should just be playing for second place. And again, to be fair, yeah, that's kind of the position that she's in at this point, but again, not the best strat to just be openly telling her that. And again, we do proceed to see Katie calling him a bully and that Tom sucks today and is being mean and she doesn't like it, which again is such strange content to get from Tom here, who's meant to be one of the most popular winners of all time. There again, they end up showing him as just kind of a dick here right before his win, though obviously, to be fair, that ends up fitting into how penultimate episodes are usually edited in a way to kind of mask the season's eventual winner. But again, this does lead to Tom saying to Ian that if you think Katie's with us, then you're crazy, and that she's playing us, with Ian seemingly being annoyed at Tom for how he strong-armed Katie in this spot, with again this leading to Ian considering taking Tom out, which again I don't think he would have done anyway. But again, all this certainly doesn't help Tom's game in any way, but again, it wouldn't end up mattering, as again, we get to the immunity challenge, which ends up being another obstacle course challenge, with this one having to memorize tiles on the other side, go back and forth to replicate it. A challenge that, again, shockingly has Tom and Ian in the lead, though we do end up seeing Jen actually performing pretty admirably through this as well. But really, again, most people seem to suck at the actual memorization portions of this, where again, it should not be that hard to memorize a board, especially with no decoy tiles there. So again, we see Ian get it wrong multiple times, only for Tom to obviously pull out the win, again starting his immunity run that lasts until the end of the season. So I do find it funny how Tom himself even calls himself lucky for this immunity win, but really there isn't much going on between here and Tribal, where lots of the setup for the vote end up actually happening beforehand. But it was pretty clear that Karen was going home, with Katie and Ian reaffirming their loyalty here, and while taking out Ian or Jen were Katie's only real moves at this point to go on to win the season, as again, she to get the end of Karen to win. I do think by this point, Katie was, again, very much playing for second. And again, with that in mind, I think there's a lot of merit to taking Karen out, as by taking Karen out, it essentially means that you're guaranteed seconds. Literally everyone left in the game is going to take you to the end, which is, again, good, though I think more of the reason why she votes out Karen here is more so because she didn't want to risk a Karen win. Again, we get the tribal where we do end up regurgitating the Katie-Ian fight, but the more interesting content here ends up coming from Karen, who clearly knew she was going home in this spot and does at least, again, try to stay, with her again lashing out at Ian, calling him out for double dealing between her and Katie, and saying that he had a deal with Greg to take Katie out, which again, I don't know if he did, but we do end up actually seeing Tom backing him up here, saying that Karen was the one that wanted Katie out, with us getting a very funny Karen reaction here and calling Tom a liar. But again, brings us back to, like, why is Tom wanting Karen out in this spot? Where again, I get the notion of wanting Ian to stay, as again, he looks at Ian as a shield, but the problem is that Ian isn't actually a shield for him, as Katie very much wants to go to the end with him, and Ian himself is considering taking out Tom, and is most likely to actually beat Tom in competitions, to where again, Ian staying here is just so bad for Tom's game. Though also beyond that, I also question, like, why isn't Tom just trying to make a move against Jen, who again was the strongest competitor of the women here, and someone that again, he had no real connective tissue to at this point, to where again, it should have been like easy to turn the votes onto Jen, you know, if Tom had any actual influence in the game. But again, this ends up leading to more bickering between Katie and Ian, where again, says she has no clue what she's doing, and what do you know, does what she was going to do to begin with, and ends up voting out Karen, again, in a unanimous vote. But also I question, like, why is he, like, kind of burning Karen on her way out? Where again, which again, like, again, Tom was winning in a jury vote anyway at the very end. But again, why are you doing this? You're making it less likely that Karen wants to vote for you, because again, you're essentially just calling her a liar on her way out, which is just so unnecessary. But again, with that, we end up losing Karen, who is someone that I think was a really fun character on the show, and one that we probably wouldn't have gotten had this not been Survivor Palau. Again, I think she's more than likely one of the first few boots on most given seasons. Again, because it's Survivor Palau, she makes it emerge and makes it pretty deep into the game, despite the fact that she's a seemingly terrible player. Now, I will say, again, there's definitely some merit there here and there. Again, the fact that she, again, picks Willard, knowing that he's a shield for her, the fact that she does some pretty good work with building her relationship with Tom, and again, well, Tom was never really that loyal to her. I do think she doesn't necessarily play the last couple rounds that poorly, though obviously I think a major issue is just simply the fact that she is someone that most people don't like. Again, seemingly most of Karor just kind of hated her, and again, the fact that she wasn't able to get Katie to do something that was in her best interest and trying to get to the end of her, again, I think is also damning for Karen here, to where, again, I think Karen is a pretty bad player, but again, was a fun character at points. The fact that she's definitely someone that's willing to get into confrontations definitely made her a fun character on the show. Now, moving on to the finale, which ends up being one of the best finales in the history of the show, and while it obviously leads up to a predictable Tom win, I do feel like we get a lot of chaos on the way there, and we probably get one of the most tragic downfalls in the history of the show. Also, a pretty decent final tribal as well, where again, I think most of the pieces that comprise this finale end up being pretty strong. But we do start off with the focus on Ian after having Karen thrown him under the bus at the end of the previous episode, and Ian now feeling like his stock with the jury has gone down. But he does end up propping up Tom now as the biggest target, to which we do end up seeing Ian seemingly being finally on board with taking out Tom, where, I mean, after the Final Four breakfast, which we're doing that still for some reason, we do see him have a conversation with Katie and Jen, to where they end up talking about how it's Tom's time to go. And Ian says it's his responsibility to beat Tom in the challenge, and if Tom doesn't win, he's going home. But if he does win, he'll still be his best friend again. Which, I mean, yeah, if you don't go on to tell him that you're going to vote him out. But again, this is a point where I do think this is a true knock against Tom's winning game here, where again, I do think he would have been a goner here had he not won immunity in this spot. Again, in a spot where he literally wins immunity through literal luck, as again, we get to the immunity challenge, where it is another physical obstacle course challenge that, what a shocker, Tom and Ian end up being the two that move on to round two, though to be fair, we do have Jen again actually performing pretty decently and was actually in the lead at a point, though again ultimately loses it. But again, we get to the final part of this challenge, which is again literally just luck of the two having to just guess a lock combo, to where despite Ian being the first to get to the lock, Tom ends up getting the combination first, winning immunity once again, where again, considering this challenge was one that literally came down to pure luck, I do feel like this is again kind of the epitome of what I talk about when challenges can be highly variant, where again, had Ian just stumbled upon the lock combo before Tom does, Ian likely goes on to win the game. But again, with Tom winning immunity here, we do obviously see the target shifting over to Jen, though we do end up seeing Jen campaigning here to Tom, trying to get Tom to do what's in his best interest of voting out Ian, as again, that would essentially guarantee that he goes on to win final immunity and in turn win the game. But no, Tom turns her down, saying that he made a promise to face off against Ian at the end, and he can't do that because of their bond, and says that when the other guy stands by you, you stand by him. Even saying confessional here that he's taking a risk that could cost him $1 million, but this is his move. All this again being a bit underwhelming to see from Tom here, where again, I do think as time goes on, Tom does end up being remembered as a player with this killer instinct in the game and is willing to make these moves necessary to win. But again, I really don't think he does. Where he is the type of player that actually is very reactionary. I feel like he's the type of player that will be extremely loyal to you until the point where you show disloyalty yourself. So at the first moment that he's wronged, again, he will retaliate, but if he never realizes that you're against him, again, he ends up being a very honor-bound player as long as that honor is reciprocated. Which again is another negative for me when I assess Tom as a player, where again, I will give him credit that he at least does have that switch to be willing to cut people when he realizes he's being lied to. But again, I would have much more faith in him as a player if he was willing to do so proactively, instead of just being beaten over the head with what the correct call should be before he actually ends up making it. But again, this ends up leading to a really interesting segment here with us cutting to nighttime, right before they get sent off to Tribal, to where we end up having what was seemingly going to be a final conversation between Tom and Ian before the vote off, with Tom telling him that he's making a decision that could cost him $1 million. And Ian, in this moment, to his infinite wisdom, proceeds to say that would have been a difficult decision for him today, and he's happy he didn't have to make it. Again, this is just another boneheaded thing that Ian ends up doing across this endgame stretch, to where, again, he just gets himself into trouble here for no real reason, with Tom here being aghast, saying that he thought it would be an easy choice, and is upset that Ian might not have chosen him, and it does make him think, which is finally the point where it clicks to him that there's just no reason to remain loyal to Ian in this spot, where again, it took some terrible play from Ian to make him go through with this really just feeling so much like an ego-driven move more than a strategic one, as again, he always knew what the correct call was, that the best decision for his game was to take out Ian, but again, wasn't doing so under the guise of honor. But now with Ian showing that he's not reciprocating that honor, again, Tom obviously turns on him at a point where, again, this doesn't feel like a change-up because of any real game rationale, as either way, it would have been dumb for him to go to the final three with Ian, who again is tougher to beat in immunity, and even in this spot, Tom Murray knew that Ian wasn't taking him to the end, where again, both pretty openly knew that the other was taking Katie to the end. So again, from a game perspective, it's not like this information that Ian is against him really matters in this spot where Tom has immunity at 4, and this isn't a move based on game logic, more so just again on the fact that his ego got hurt, that Ian were never as loyal to him as he was the Ian back. But again, through this, we do literally get some last minute scrambling, with Tom going to Jen and asking her about Ian, with Jen doing some good work here to reveal to him that Ian had been plotting against him behind his back, saying that he did end up saying that he would have voted Tom out, and then finally saying, "Oh, you didn't know?" Which again, obviously not. And again, this is some good work from Jen, and a reason why I do think a lot of people look at Jen as a pretty solid player coming out of this season. But my question is, again, like, why did it take you until now to rat out Ian? Again, she had this information the entire time, and if Tom had not approached her here, she would have just been on her way out in a very unceremonious way, to where I don't get why she didn't end up writing this out previously to save herself, to get Tom on her side. Where again, previously we had gotten this scene of literally everybody going to her and telling her that she's going home, yet she just didn't bother. Using this as part of her campaign is again very questionable, but this doesn't lead to a fight leading into Tribal, with Tom confronting Ian about this information, and again being on this massive high horse saying, "Am I the fool for doing the right thing?" And Ian ends up admitting to that he did talk about taking out Tom, and Tom says, "Okay, that's all I need to know." And again, this really comes off as Tom scolding Ian for trying to play the game. And I know the common assumption nowadays also with this is the fact that Tom is manipulating Ian in this moment, which obviously ends up playing to his benefit by the following round. And while again it plays out that way, I personally don't feel like any of this was intentional. I feel like Tom was legitimately just hurt by this, and this is just him lashing out at Ian to justify his move of turning against him. Oh, Ian is seemingly just this genuinely nice guy being remorseful for what happens here, which ends up clearly messing with his head, as seemingly we get to Tribal with Ian just looking deep in thought, with this again being right after that previous fight, with Jeff even mentioning the fact that they're starting Tribal a bit later tonight, which again, obviously because production allowed it. But it ends up being a really intense Tribal here, really being this complete beatdown on Ian, with Tom saying it was going to be Jen, and then he found out that he was a fool being played to risk $1 million due to honor and wouldn't have gotten it in return, only for Ian again to dig a deeper hole here, for some reason pretending like he had told Tom about these plots against him. But he ends up saying like our deal was us trying to get to 3, only for Tom to say no, we go to 3, not try, only for Ian to say that he's upset that Tom is using the words of someone cornered over him, with Tom saying he's not listening to Jen, I'm listening to you. All these pretty good lines from Tom, I will say. Again, as much as I do think Tom is a master bullshitter, I do feel like he does have some pretty good comebacks in this moment. But again, I think Tom is just very clearly angry throughout this entire conversation. And to add to that, we then have Katie jumping into the fray, saying that Ian is so concerned about what Tom thinks, but not her. Which I'll say, I really do not like how Katie ends up handling a lot of this situation. All of it feeling like her just further dunking on Ian when he's already down. Where again, you just clearly tell how much Ian is struggling in this spot. And Katie just continuously tries to make it all about her and just continues to scold him. Though, despite that, ends up still siding with him, which again makes all this even feel that much more unnecessary here, though. And again, we do end up getting another awkward moment from this when she ends up asking him if he's lied to her in the last 24 hours, only for Ian to then stall before eventually saying no. Which again, Ian is just so bad in these style of confrontations. But again, we get to the vote, which ends up being a 2v2 between Ian and Jen, with again Katie sticking true to Ian, with Tom obviously flipping, funnily accidentally getting us into a tie where, again, funny that despite all of this and Tom finally deciding to turn on Ian, the best that he could do is just tie the vote. But again, this ends up leading to a nearly unprecedented tie at the final 4 up to this point in Survivor. Where, again, the last time we got this was in Survivor Marquesas, where at that point we obviously got Rox. Where from that point forward, it was always assumed that Rox was going to be the tiebreaker at final 4. Though, obviously that hadn't been tested, as again, we never saw them go to a tiebreaker in the years since. And though it hasn't happened since then, I do feel that they weren't going to do Rox again after what happened in Marquesas, as again, having Rox at 4 is just kind of dumb, as again, by the technical rules of how Rox are supposed to operate, again, you can't really have a Rock draw, as the people tied in the vote are meant to be immune, while also the immunity winner has immunity, which means that there's only one person that can go home, which is why on Survivor Marquesas we had them have to play around with even those rulings by having the people tied in the vote also draw a Rock, which is kind of a mess, which leads into the other issue of having Rox at 4, as we see in Survivor All-Stars, in that it doesn't really even incentivize you to go and cause a tie at final 4. As again, if you're the one that doesn't have immunity, ends up siding with one of the people in the tie, then you're essentially just putting yourself in danger for not as much benefit at the time. To where again, it ends up kind of stifling gameplay in that way, as again, if you're the non-immune person, you're probably just going to back down to whatever the immune duo ends up wanting to do, as we saw with Jenna Lewis in All-Stars. So again, I do feel fairly confident that Rox at 4 was something that was changed along the way, though again, we never got to see what it changed to. And I know production themselves refused to clarify what the tiebreaker would be, seemingly saving it for when it eventually happened. I do think it's really dumb, as again, how are you going to make an informed decision on how to play the game when you don't know what's going to happen when you do those things? As again, it just makes it less likely that people are even going to try to test it. But again, here we do finally see another 2-2 tie happen, and kind of naturally in the fact that obviously just Tom flips at the last second, giving us the answer to what the tiebreaker is, which is fire making, which obviously we had just saw being used when Oolong got down to 2. And I will say, I don't know if this was always intended to be the final 4 tiebreaker, where the sense I get is that they had a loose idea of there being a challenge to decide who goes in this spot, but it wasn't until around this season that fire making specifically was decided as what challenge it would be. As again, we even see on All Stars that they still were using a fire making challenge as a standard immunity challenge there, to where obviously it would be kind of weird for them to do 2 fire making challenges, as obviously it would be kind of weird for them to do a fire making challenge as immunity and also as a tiebreaker, which, to be fair, I mean, that probably adds more credence to the fact that this wasn't a fully decided format change until maybe after All Stars. But again, with this inclusion of fire making here, this ends up being the standard for years down the road. Obviously, up until HHH, again, had there ever been a tie at Final Four from this point on, we do get fire making used in that spot. Well, again, obviously now we have forced fire making, to where we have it on every season, thank God. But again, with it being Ian versus Jen, it ends up being a largely lopsided challenge here, and us seeing Ian get a pretty easy win, starting to fire right away, with this being one of the biggest blowouts we've had in a fire making challenge on the show. And we end up seeing Jen leaving pretty bitter at Katie, where I know the two were pretty close, and Jen was intending on taking Katie to the final two. And I do think you can question if this was even the right call for Katie. So again, whether it's Jen or Ian, both of them would take her to the end anyway, and Ian is probably more likely to vote for her at the end after being betrayed. But again, at this point, I do think Katie was already just kind of playing for second place and more so just wanted her friends to win. And again, considering the fact she was closer to Ian, and that was already what was planned beforehand, was to side with Ian, I think that she just went along with it. But I think you can question if it's the correct strategic decision, though at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter anyway. But again, with that, we end up losing Jen. And sadly, obviously, if you do not know, Jen has passed away since the season aired, actually being the first ever Survivor alumni to pass away, sadly succumbing to cancer around the time of Heroes vs. Villains, which I do think ends up being a large aspect of Jen's legacy, where Jen is a player that, again, simply was under-edited to a pretty ridiculous degree. I mean, Jen gets one of the quietest edits up to this point in Survivor, to where, again, I think if you watched the season and kind of forgot Jen existed by the end, I think it wouldn't be that shocking. But Jen is somebody that is remembered very fondly. I know from a postseason perspective, she is somebody that went to a lot of fan events, and most people seem to genuinely like, to where obviously she was a massive loss to the Survivor community when she did eventually pass away. But again, as for her as a player, I do feel like Jen is a player that has potential. I think there definitely is a lot of skill there, and when we see her actively play the game, she is seemingly playing pretty well. Again, her like solidifying that flip in Tom at the tail end, again, her surviving that final 5 vote was kind of insane. And again, she just seems to have some pretty good relationships in the game. And I do think if she had gotten to the end against Katie, which was her plan, again, she does win. I think she has a chance against Ian. And again, was always targeting Tom through this end game. To where, again, I think Jen is a, again, competent player. I think there's, again, a lot of issues with how passive she was at points in the game. But still, as a whole, I think Jen is, again, a very solid player from this season. But again, it's one that sadly was just kind of overshadowed in the edit. But with that, we then move on to the final 3 round, which starts off with way more drama than you would expect at the final 3, with, again, Ian just getting raked over the coals by both Tom and Katie, with Tom even saying that it's a personal grudge now. Where again, we see him fighting in the middle of the night, while Katie ends up piping in, defending Tom for sticking with Ian for some reason. And again, we do have Ian saying that he's being crucified for a decision that he didn't even make, and Tom says, "You didn't get the chance." And we have Katie cutting in, saying that you were making double deals and you got caught, which, again, it's just kind of dumb. I think all this is just super hypocritical, as again, like, Katie, you got caught too, making deals with Greg and Jen, and again, Tom was making deals with Karen. So again, all this is so stupid and hypocritical, but again, Tom says that it's Weasley and you slipped up and you blew it. And again, all these comments obviously do end up playing a major role in Ian's state of mind coming into the immunity challenge, with him saying that it's the worst night of his life and that he didn't come out to be this backstabber and villain, which is funny, as again, Ian hasn't really done anything that bad. Again, he hasn't even been that cutthroat in the game. Where obviously, again, he did lead the vote in taking out Greg, which, again, took out Greg a round earlier than they were going to. Again, how villainous. And again, we have him obviously talking about taking out Tom, which also same thing. Again, how dare he take Tom to Final 4 and cut him before Final 3. But even that one, he didn't actually fully go through it. As again, he didn't really have the chance. But again, we do see Ian in this spot questioning if what he did was wrong, or if he was just playing the game. And again, Ian's arc through his finale here ends up being so interesting to me, being this exploration on the toll that the game has on you, which again really culminates in a really interesting way, as we see at the immunity challenge. But again, that ends up taking us to the rites of passage, which was pretty boring, though. But again, what's kind of funny to see these Koror members reminiscing about the Oolong members who they barely knew, and funny how they didn't even have any words for Willard. But again, this ends up taking us to the final immunity challenge, which I think, alongside Hands on Heart Idol, probably the most iconic final immunity challenge in the show's history. In this being Baba Booey, a pretty simple endurance challenge of just standing on a disc attached to a pole that's connected to a buoy, to where whoever ends up standing the longest ends up winning, which is ultimately a relatively easy challenge, leading to this lasting a very long time. And by that, I mean almost 12 hours, obviously the longest any challenge has lasted in Survivor US history, where obviously nowadays production has really upped the difficulty of these challenges to make them as short as possible to allow them to fit within the schedule, to where I'm sure this challenge is one of the reasons that made them change this, as we never see a challenge following this go to nearly this length. But despite that, this ends up being one of the most notable moments in this season, but also in the show's history, and one that Jeff even talks about fondly to this day, but one that, again, really does not fit into what Survivor's trying to do nowadays, which is why it kind of ends up being a bit of a game-changing moment for the show as well. Again, as we get the challenge started, we do get a fun little moment of Ian saying that it's going to take a while, and Tom saying it'll be a couple hours, but we do end up actually zooming through time pretty quickly in this challenge, where we end up seeing Katie dropping out around the 5-hour mark, which in itself is nothing to scoff at, but obviously this leads to this really epic showdown between Tom and Ian, with us seeing them competing in silence for most of it, with Jeff even mentioning at a point that no one's spoken in 4.5 hours, which is pretty insane to just be standing there in silence in the middle of the night for that long. But this is where we finally get to some deals being thrown around, with Tom now offering to take Ian if he steps down, and we see Ian saying if he jumps down first, we have a deal, where again at this point Ian is still clearly trying to be playing for himself, with Tom saying that you're afraid of going against me and you should just take the $100,000 and pay off some loans. Essentially just telling Ian that you're expecting to beat him. Again, a great way to get somebody to agree to go to Final 2 with them. But this does lead to a pretty badass moment for Tom, and him saying, I can't step down, and I won't step down. Again, being another one of these moments that has a lot of gravitas to it. Ultimately, Ian has a line here that I do think really ends up explaining his state of mind when he makes his later decision of saying, I'm not going to go out on your terms. Though following that, we end up cutting to the 11-hour 45-minute mark, obviously being pitch black outside, which is where Ian ends up restarting the negotiations with Tom, with him saying that he has a solution, saying that he'll step down if Tom takes Katie, and giving up $1 million to buy back their friendship, with Jeff clearly being confused at what's happening here, as most people would be confused at this. Again, just seeing Ian here stand on this buoy for almost 12 hours, just all of a sudden just blurred out that he's willing to essentially quit the game to reclaim his friendship with Tom and Katie is, again, such an insane conclusion to this challenge. And again, such a quick, change of heart for Ian, who again, obviously went to extreme lengths to try to beat Tom in this challenge, which ultimately ends up feeling like the culmination of this beating Ian had been taking from an emotional level across these last few days, with him now being so beaten down that he's going to give up his chance to win the game. And again, people end up giving credit to Tom for this, though I generally don't think there was much intention from Tom's point of view. I don't think he was actively trying to break Ian down so he would give up. Where I think the only parts that you can even debate are intentional are when Jeff is asking Tom if Ian would be successful if he did drop down, and Tom says, yes, it would earn my respect back. But again, even in that spot, it's a spot where, again, Ian had already said he's going to drop out. Tom just saying yes to the deal isn't that much manipulation there. But also I want to talk about this from, obviously, Ian's point of view, where obviously people have talked about this in the past as one of the dumbest moves in history of Survivor, again, throwing away a potential win. And again, I think there's just so much nuance to this than that. Now again, is this a dumb move if you want to go on to win the game? Yes. And through that, again, if you want to look at this as simply a game move, again, it was a bad move. It is one that, again, cost him the game. But that's the thing, though, is that Ian wasn't making this as a game move. Again, he clearly recognized what he was doing and that this would cost him the game in doing so. But again, he made the move for out of the game reasons, not because he even cared about what the effect that this would have on the game, but more so because Ian himself felt this massive guilt on his hands. Again, feeling like he was at fault for this disruption in his relationship with Tom and Katie, to where, again, he even says in this moment that he feels like a traitor to himself and he can't leave the game with this on his shoulders, where, again, this was clearly a move more so made for Ian's own mental health. To where, again, I think the reality is that Ian is just someone that is just a bit too nice for the game. To where, while he does seem very naturally talented for the game, I think he's just too kind of a soul that simply can't handle the more cutthroat aspects of the game, to where, again, it's not shocking that Ian proceeded to have no interest in ever playing Survivor again, where despite being called numerous times for later returning seasons, he ends up always turning it down. And I think it's fully understandable when looking at how this experience played out for him. Again, surely being a learning experience for him, but one that obviously very much messed with his mental health to the point where, again, I could see why he would never want to do this again. And obviously leads to this being an extremely notable moment for the show. one, I love how this is edited here and how it's portrayed with such gravitas, with this like triumph of music playing as Tom wins his 5th immunity on the season, tying the record of Colby, again, a record that stands to this day. But again, we end up transitioning from that to this like emotional music as Ian and Katie hug goodbye, and Jeff ends up deciding to have this impromptu tribal with again, the challenge having lasted 11 hours and 55 minutes, and us now being at the point where we're past even the time that tribal would normally occur. And with this obviously also being a pretty foregone conclusion, it ends up leading to Tom having to make this verbal vote, with Tom voting out his buddy Ian. With even in this spot, Tom ends up actually like kind of offering to take Ian despite this deal, though again, Ian ends up saying that we had a deal, which again is a nice payoff to their relationship, which again, all this is such a notable scene to me. Actually, the last memory I have of Survivor from when I was a kid, where again, I watched the show with my parents and have pretty vivid memories of moments from like the Amazon, Pearl Islands, All Stars, but again, lastly, Palau, with again, this moment here, this final immunity challenge, and Ian dropping out at the very end is something that did stick in my mind despite not watching Survivor for another 7 years following this, which, I mean, normally I would obviously not like this, though I think in this spot, obviously it's a very special situation, which obviously like normally I wouldn't like the concept of impromptu tribal, as I think the players themselves should always have the chance to save themselves, but obviously this is a very special case where again, it doesn't bother me as much here. But again, with that, we end up losing Ian, and again, Ian is a very interesting player on this season in the sense that, again, I think personally, I think Ian played the best game of this season. I think he is someone that was the best positioned for a lot of the game, also had the most amount of influence in the game, and again, I think coming into this rewatch, I was expecting me to be in a spot where I think Ian is for sure the best player of this season. However, I think on the rewatch, I think it becomes very clear how flawed Ian is as a player. Again, the fact that he just has all these little missteps towards the end game that end up being so disastrous for his game, end up being things that, again, definitely knock him a bit from my overall thoughts of him as a player, where again, I think naturally he is a very skilled player. Again, he is someone that is, again, very good physically, seemingly good socially, and again, definitely has this killer instinct at points. Again, the problem is, again, I think he just opens his mouth a bit too much. Also, again, he just simply does not have the heart for the game, to where while he has like the ability to recognize what his correct strategic decision should be, he actually struggles with actually doing those things. And I think that is obviously a thing that, especially when it's with people that he has these like very deep attachments to, and again, obviously that is an issue with Ian as a player, though Ian as a character, I actually thought was a pretty good one here. Obviously his trajectory through the season is very interesting. I think the way he ends up going out is, again, super notable. One of the best story arcs in the history of the show from my point of view, but also a character that even before this entire like tragedy happens with him, he's still actually a pretty entertaining presence. Again, he has very witty confessionals. He comes off as this very likable presence, to where, again, I think Ian is someone that brought a lot to the show. The one that I'm personally actually pretty okay with him being like a one-time player. I know, obviously, again, he's been in the running for multiple returnee seasons, and while, again, I would not necessarily be opposed to seeing him back, I think he's someone that has a fantastic one-time arc that I don't necessarily need to see followed up on. But with that, we're now at the final two, where we do actually waste a decent amount of time on showing Tom and Katie being excited over being the final two and talking about what it means to be in the final two, which was pretty boring. But here we do end up seeing them create a bonfire through burning their picnic table, which seemed like kind of a waste. But at this point, it was a pretty foregone conclusion Tom was going to end up winning here. And again, everyone knew it. The audience knew it. The jury knew it. Tom knew it. And obviously Katie knew it. Where, again, Katie talks about just wanting credit for the way that she played the game, which, again, that ends up being a shame. All Tom ends up talking about tonight, there's no treacheries or half-truths, which is funny considering I feel like that's actually most of his final tribal performance. But again, we get the final tribal, and we do get the opening statements with Tom calling Karor his family and saying that he doesn't deserve it more than any of them, and really just gives the most pageanty answers that, again, would not work on me, though does seem to work on most people, and again, that really just goes with most of the BS that comes out of Tom's mouth. Oh, Katie ends up articulating her game pretty decently here, again, saying that she dealt with the cards that she could play and played for self-preservation and was able to execute her plan, where, again, I thought she had a decent enough opening words, but again, it wasn't going to end up mattering, especially against Tom. But again, we then get to the jury questioning, which again ends up being pretty strong here with a lot of bitterness for Katie in particular, but also some negativity sent Tom's way as well, where while the result here was pretty obvious, we do get some fun moments from all this. Now, I'll say I did find it pretty surprising that we do start off with Kobe, who obviously, as expected, ends up being one of the most bitter jury members on the board, with him starting by saying that he has issues and he's bringing them. And it is funny that as he says this, like both Tom and Katie are kind of like laughing around, which is like, be laughing too much longer, as he literally proceeds to say that he doesn't respect how they played the game, and says to Katie that if you get my vote tonight, it's not because of how you played the game. To which he ends up going on to bash Katie So as he does so, you see her smirk just fading from her face, as again he ends up calling her out for sitting out in challenges, for doing nothing around camp, and not mustering enough energy to serve coconuts, talking about her social skills don't go outside of her alliance, and the only quality that she brings to the game is riding the coattails of people that are actually playing the game, which again, while harsh, I actually don't feel like this is necessarily an unfair assessment of Katie here, with again, this perception is one that you're typically going to get while playing the game that you're playing, essentially you being this kingmaker and you working with the biggest players in the game and not doing anything to take them out. But he ends up saying here that if I vote for you, it's not for you, it's against Tom, with Kobe proceeding to call him out for playing as dirty as he would have liked to play, saying you've played as dirty of a game as Ian, with Tom just shaking his head throughout this, which again, I think it was funny to see like Tom being called out for his hypocrisy, with Kobe saying that you dance around your lies and that he isn't buying it, but again, Kobe being exactly how I personally would feel about Tom if I was on the island. But again, all this obviously setting up for Kobe to be the only person that doesn't end up voting for Tom by the end. But then we do get to Greg, which ends up being a surprisingly harsh jury speech after having come off as very game body throughout most of the season. Again, calling Katie worthless around camp and insignificant and embarrassing in challenges. And says that she could have at least made some friends around camp, but instead she made fun of the jury members and betrayed them. And questions how being so pathetic is her plan to win, which again is so harsh here, especially in a spot where again, Katie was so shocked by this, where obviously she thought she was close to Greg, and again was in a spot where she wanted Greg to stay, but just simply flipped the last second because she didn't want to go to Rock. And again, we end up seeing her like get emotional here, saying that she's sorry he had to go there, and that she would never say anything like that to him, which again, I do very much feel for Katie in this spot. So, again, I think she never expected Greg to be one of her harshest critics from the jury, but it's also probably being the spot where she knew that she 100% had no semblance of a chance of possibly winning a jury vote here. But as for Tom, we do get Greg questioning about why he should vote for him when they had a deal that they would not vote for anybody that went against their alliance, with Tom responding to this by throwing Ian under the bus, which is kind of a common thing he does at this final tribal. Again, talking about how he regrets it and how he believed Ian when he shouldn't have, which is again kind of funny, as I actually think taking out Greg was one of the only like strategic moves that I think Tom actually did well in the end game stretch. And again, I don't know if telling Greg, this like very game-centric player, that you got played by Ian is like a great way of winning his jury vote, though again, you're against Katie, so it doesn't matter. But then we get to Steph, who ends up calling out Tom here for not fighting for her to stay, with Tom saying that he went as far as he could and was more worried about preserving his alliance, aka him essentially just telling Stephanie that I cared more about this other alliance I made after the alliance I made with you than actually trying to keep you in the game, which again isn't very honorable of him. But I do think she ends up taking this answer pretty well here. Oh, I did like seeing Katie here like fighting back against this and saying that Tom came to her about wanting Steph out, which again, I don't even know if this is necessarily true, but again, fun to see some bickering between the two here, with Katie at least still trying despite her clearly not winning. And again, that ends up not really lasting anyway. But then we return to more Katie haters, with us getting Janu up next, with her giving Tom a pretty big softball and asking him how he had to compromise with his integrity, and Tom proceeding to say that he never crossed lines, is playing with as much honor as he can. But then we have her going to Katie, which with her just kind of peacefully asking for some positive adjectives for how she played the game, where Katie ends up again kind of going nuclear at this point, proceeding to not even give Janu an answer here and saying that she doesn't expect a vote from her and doesn't need to do that, with Janu saying you're just assuming you don't have my vote, which again, that's a fair assumption, but again, obviously not great from Katie in this spot where, again, at this point, I think she kind of loses the plot and gives up, but again, she couldn't win anyway. And with that, we move on to Karen, who is seemingly upset at both of them, but obviously Katie more than Tom, but again, she ends up asking Tom if their relationship was real, with Tom once again talking about how he was tricked into taking her out by Ian, and it nearly cost him the game, and saying that he never lied to her, even though, again, we literally get footage on the show of him telling her that she's going to 3 with him and Ian. But again, she ultimately asks if she was just a pawn to him, only for Tom to say, I won't even answer that. I'll let you know what side your heart, which again, I would have rolled my eyes in this moment. But we then obviously cut to her scolding Katie, saying she observed how phony and cruel she was to everybody but Tom and Ian, and also observed her being the laziest at camp, mean, bad at challenges, unkind, which, I mean, again, you literally just said mean. You didn't need to say the same thing twice, essentially, but also betrayed me, which did she? And asks for one reason why I should vote for you. Obviously, all saying this in a very spiteful way. Though, again, I'm kind of surprised Katie even bothered to answer this one initially, saying that she's not unkind, because obviously that's the one thing you need to clear up here. But eventually does end up taking a dig at Karen. After Karen accuses her of just riding with her alliances, and Katie saying that this game is about making alliances, and you're sitting there because you didn't make one, with Karen saying, I got it, thanks, which I thought all that was kind of funny. But then we get to Jen, who we see her actually probably being one of the spiciest towards Tom here, calling him a chauvinist, and asks why she should vote for him when he clearly didn't respect her, only for Tom to admit that he didn't respect her until his conversation with Ian, aka right before she went home, and when she was actually beneficial to his game, and even says here that you hid your game, so you didn't have a game to see, which again just felt very questionable in how he responds to this. But Jen ends up then calling out Katie for not playing like a strong woman, because she got disrespected over and over again, I guess. But again, all this felt very reminiscent of how like Parvati was treated, and here's the villains for like not going against Russell. But then we finish this all off with Ian, which was a pretty boring jury question to wrap this up with, asking them the biggest reason that they shouldn't win the game, with Tom again giving the most BS answer about how just being here with you guys is payday, to which we finally see Kobe just groaning on the jury. But we do then get to the closing statements, which were pretty uneventful, with Tom giving the same spiel that wasn't going to matter anyway, as he already had the game won, all while Katie just says, give me a chance, and I knew I didn't have a chance against this guy, and I'm leaving with my self-respect, but I might not leave with yours. With, again, just being kind of sad for Katie here, who obviously took a major beating at Final Tribal here, and obviously fully knew that none of this was going to matter. But obviously we get to the votes, where obviously we see Janu voting for Tom, because he picked her at the schoolyard pick, I guess, because obviously that's the only reason. Oh, well, Kobe ends up saying that he asked for honesty and he got it, but not from you, Tom, as he holds up the vote for Katie. But either way, we then cut to New York City for the vote reveal, where, again, just imagine if Tom lost while in his home city, while also being a firefighter during 9/11. Even before we get the vote reveal, we get a lot of massive cheers for Tom from the crowd, where, again, it would have been so funny to see him losing this spot, but obviously Tom gets an easy win here, again, winning 6-1, where, again, for most people, obviously this is a very satisfying conclusion to the season, with Tom being one of the most popular winners at the time, where by the time he ends up coming back for Heroes with Villains, he was considered one of the biggest gets on that cast. Though if you can't tell, and I don't particularly love Tom as a winner, with, again, from a gameplay perspective, his win largely comes down to challenges, which again I don't love within the game of Survivor. But again, from a more storyline perspective, I do appreciate how unique of a winner Tom was for this point in the show, with him being the first like heroic alpha leader figure to go on the win with those style of players, again not typically being long for the game at this point in the series. And to be fair, again, I think Tom obviously got very fortunate in being able to get deep into the game, where again obviously a lot of that came down to like the dominance of Karor, and through that also winning 5 out of the 7 immunity challenges on this season, which is a pretty insane stat. I think only beaten by Aussie in Cook Islands, which again for many fans is looked at as very impressive, though again I personally just find it kind of lame, to where again I would have loved if Tom was able to do the same thing he did, but again just without needing those challenge wins. But again, him being this perceived like really well-rounded player is a major reason why people do love Tom on this season. And again, I do think Tom is very significant to the history of the show, but again, Strabe does not have a winning trajectory that I personally like. But again, that ends up being the end of the proper season, but I do want to briefly talk about the reunion show, which ends up being a pretty fun one here. I did provide for some pretty funny moments, the first of which being a funny little moment after Tom giving a spiel about his win, which ends up leading to Jeff saying that this is why you won, because in your answers you give nothing and end up not offending anybody, which was funny to see him be called out for this at the reunion show. But we also end up seeing like Jeff try to get one on Katie, like being annoyed at how she threw away Janu's jury vote, only for like Janu to confirm that she already had her mind made up, leading to Jeff giving this like very annoyed face, to where we actually do get a lot of that in this reunion show, of Jeff just like expecting a certain answer and just not getting it, to where we even see him at a point saying, it's like, I'm being played with. And leading up to probably what is my favorite moment of this reunion show, and possibly of any reunion show, and us getting Jeff going off on this big spiel about how he didn't coerce Janu into quitting, and asks if anyone here thinks I did, only for Kobe to just like sheepishly raise his hand. again. And Jeff just like instantly dismissed that, saying that he can't even get somebody to quit the game, as if you're coming into the game wanting to quit, I'll get it out of you and you'll quit, which is like, okay, yeah, that's also you getting them to quit the game though. And that ends up transitioning us to another very awkward moment where he goes on to talk about engineered quits, pointing straight to Jeff Wilson. To which I love how like Jeff Wilson's instant response to this is just to talk about how he's now officially dubbed Coconut Boy by fans, which obviously I'm sure everybody's going up to Jeff Wilson calling him Coconut Boy because he cut a coconut one time on the show. But this leads to a pretty lengthy sequence of Jeff like kind of scolding him for essentially quitting the game, alongside also looping in Ashley and Kim into this. Again, something that Jeff just seems to really be annoyed by, to where we even have him at the end of the reunion show when like asking people to apply for the show, saying only do it if you are willing to play on a broken ankle, which is such an insane thing to say. But also here we get like an awkward segment around Jonathan, with him being very defensive over Angie like trying to tell him why he was voted out and that he didn't bother talking to her, with Jeff just shutting this all down, saying no, we're not playing this out. Which is funny that we didn't continue this fight, as again we needed to see Wanda sing, with Jeff also finally trying to shut this down after she finishes the first verse, saying, "You're done," which is also funny. But again, a really funny reunion show with so many awkward moments that stem from it. But with that, again, that is the end of the season. Now let's wrap up the video by talking about the finalists, starting it off with Katie. And again, Katie's this person that I just have very complex opinions about Katie. As again, I think there are aspects of her game that are very successful. I think Katie's the style of player that probably does make it deep on many seasons, especially if she's able to find herself in the initial majority. The problem is that I think she very rarely wins. Again, I think her overall strategy is a losing one, but I think there is merit to the fact that she can find herself in a majority group and position herself the best within that majority group. Again, the issue is that she's largely doing that by just enabling the stronger players around her, to where, again, I think it would be a lot more satisfying of a game if she was able to, again, have some agency of her own and cut those bigger players before the end and make a path for herself towards the end game. But again, she doesn't really do that part of it. But again, even the notion of just being so well positioned in the game for pretty much the entire game is something that I will at least give her credit for. And also from a character perspective, Katie's obviously an incredible character as well. Again, I think kind of like the proto Courtney Yates to a degree. Again, someone that is, again, very cutting and confessional. Someone that clearly was trying to be this like comedian and is able to like mock the likes of like Karen and Janu in a really humorous way. So again, I would have loved to see Katie play again. I think it would be interesting to see if she evolves her strategy from the first time around and still provide some of those like really fun confessionals that, again, I think would make her a really fun character on the return, though obviously I don't really expect it. And finally move on to our winner in Tom, who, again, I've kind of said my piece on Tom throughout this video. I think Tom is, again, a player that is skilled for the game for sure. Him and his peak here, again, obviously extremely dominant in challenges. Someone that definitely is good socially for the most part. Obviously, again, I think there are aspects of him that are very see-through and it doesn't really click with everybody, but he's still a very good leader. He's still able to get people to want to follow him. Also, again, like strategically, again, he is a very reactive player, but once he does react, again, he is willing to make some pretty cutthroat moves. The issue obviously stems from the fact that I think he is someone that is, again, a bit too honor bound in the game. If, again, he gives your word to you and you never break that, he's simply just never going to go against you, no matter how optimal that is for his game, which, again, I think is an issue there. I think there's also a massive issue with threat management with Tom, where, again, no one actually wanted to go to the end with Tom. Tom was essentially in a spot where he had to win out no matter how the game played out. Where, again, even his best case scenario of getting to the final three unscathed is going to the end against Katie and Ian, which is the one that we saw, and even then he faces a lot of adversity towards the end game. To where, again, I think Tom is just a player that has this massive lack of threat management and is not able to avoid that. Again, we literally see him talk about wanting to avoid that on the season and just simply isn't. Where, again, that's just not who Tom is. And I think that is obviously just a fundamental issue with Tom as a player. Now, I'll say, again, like as much as I've dogged on Tom's game, I do think Tom as a character is actually still a really interesting presence on the show. I think he, again, has some great one-liners. Again, he's clearly very savvy in social situations that can lead to, leads to him having these like fun moments of him correcting like Ian's mistakes, and obviously like from a survival aspect, which again I don't personally care about, but again he is kind of like one of the most prominent characters in the history of the show from that point of view, again having that massive shark hunting scene. So again, I fully get why people do very much like Tom on the show, and again I myself still do find Tom to be a pretty interesting character, but one that again I just think as a player is one that just doesn't play the game in a way that I personally like, and also does come off very hypocritical throughout a lot of the season, but then coming off very indignant when people don't do things that he wants them to do, and still, again, obviously a really iconic character from the show, and one that I do fully understand why he was one of the most popular winners after this season. But again, with that, that is the entirety of Survivor Palau. Again, a season that I have a lot of nostalgia for, where again, Survivor Palau is that last season I watched before I stopped watching Survivor at the time, but again, not because I didn't enjoy it back in the day. Where again, you have these like iconic moments from this season that did stick to my mind. Again, obviously the final 3 immunity challenge, again, Stephanie being on her own, Stephanie versus Bobby John and fire making. But again, those moments were ones that I remembered back in the day. But even beyond that, again, you have a really great endgame stretch with really from the Greg blindside on. You have again Ian's overall tragedy towards the endgame, which is really interesting TV. You have the obviously desolation of Oolong. You also have, again, some of the most iconic immunity challenges appearing on this season. You have some of the most iconic survival-based moments in the history of the show. So again, there's a lot to like in Survivor Palau. So again, I get why Survivor Palau is a popular season. However, at this current point, I personally do not have a particularly high opinion of Palau. So again, it's kind of in the bottom third of seasons for me. A season that, and just simply does not do the things that I personally care about in Survivor. So again, this ends up being a season that is so reliant on challenges and the survival aspects. Again, a lot of the pre-merge is just so based around Oolong losing challenges, while again, Karora ends up thriving. And then at the beginning of the quote-unquote merge is essentially just the outsiders being picked off initially. And again, from the final 6 on, it really picks up. But I really feel like it's really only the final 6 on that ends up being actually good in my eyes, where everything else is just kind of middling to just kind of boring Survivor, especially on the rewatch, where I feel like the Oolong storyline really does not hold as much on the rewatch, where it's interesting the first time you see it because it's obviously this very unique thing that happened, but it's something that I think overall just kind of harms my opinion of the season looking back on it. And while again, I think there are so many iconic aspects of this season in the grand scheme of things, it's just a season that has not held up over time. So I do find it to be a lacking season, one that obviously has its moments. But and with that, that's my opinion on Survivor Palau. Now beyond this, like the other retrospectives, again, I will be doing a player ranking for Survivor Palau at some point in the future, so stay tuned for that. Obviously, later this year is the anniversary of Survivor Guatemala, so I'll be doing the same thing for Survivor Guatemala. So I guess stay tuned for that as well. But obviously outside of that, just expect more of the same style content from the channel. But for now, that is the video. Thank you for watching.